Hi guys, welcome back to our channel, where today we're unpacking Rome's epic journey from mythic beginnings to imperial legacy in one thrilling ride. If you love history that feels alive, hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode, smash the like to help more people find this story, and drop a comment below telling us what time it is where you're watching. Let's see how global our legion really is. Get comfy, because in the next few minutes, you'll discover legends, battles, reforms, and the fall that reshaped the world. Ready? Let's march into Rome's past together today.
Imagine yourself drifting back from the rallying cry of our introduction and stepping onto the sun-bleached shores of Latium, where the salt wind carries rumors older than memory. You feel your sandals sink into warm sand as a battered fleet appears on the horizon, ghostly silhouettes that once sailed from flaming Troy itself. At the helm stands Aeneas, the resolute survivor whose destiny, according to poets and priests alike, coils around the future of this rugged peninsula. You watch him kneel, scoop a fistful of earth, and vow that the gods have not merely spared his people, they have charged them with building something greater than the city they lost. In his eyes you sense the mixture of grief and steely determination that will become a Roman hallmark. Mourn what is gone, perhaps, but never stop plotting what comes next. You follow Aeneas inland, through marshes and oak groves, alive with cicadas, feeling every squelch of mud beneath your feet. In villages of straw-thatched huts, locals trade stories of shepherd kings and nymph-haunted springs. They stare at these strangers whose accents clang like bronze against their soft Latin tongue. Yet Aeneas is neither conqueror nor beggar. He courts alliances, marries into local nobility, and etches his family's Trojan lineage into the region's collective imagination. As you listen to the old bards spin verse about the gods' intertwined plans, Venus guiding her son, Jupiter nodding toward an empire without end, you realize Rome's first blueprint is mythic, drafted in the realm where fact blurs into fable. But to the Romans who will recite it, that myth is not mere bedtime folklore. It is a charter explaining why their city must rise, rule, and endure. Years pass in the blink of an eye, and you now find yourself standing on the riverbank of the fast-flowing Tiber, its muddied current reflecting dawn's pink veneer. There, twin newborns, Romulus and Remus, wail inside a wicker basket, abandoned by order of a usurping great-uncle who fears a prophecy of their return. You feel the tension between fate and free will as the basket bumps against reeds, coming to rest just beyond the reach of drowning. A gray she-wolf pads from the underbrush, muzzle wet with dew. Her yellow eyes assess the fragile cargo, then soften. To your astonishment, she lowers herself, allowing the infants to suckle. In that astonishing moment, you can almost sense a cosmic contract being signed. Nature itself conspires to keep Rome alive. The twins grow wild and fierce, mentored by shepherds who teach them how to read the land's every contour, its defensible hills, its hidden springs, its vantage points from which to spot raiders long before their dust plumes appear. You trail behind as they chase goats up the Palatine and Aventine ridges, arguing over whose hill offers the truer promise of security and glory. Their quarrel flares into tragedy when Romulus strikes his brother dead, an act equal parts fratricide and foundation. While the sky darkens in grief, Romulus plows a sacred furrow around his chosen hill, marking the pomerium that will separate civic life from untamed wilderness. As you step over that invisible line, You understand that Rome's earliest boundary is both physical and psychological. A reminder that order must be defended against chaos, even when chaos wears your own brother's face. By traditional reckoning, the year is 753 BCE, though you notice no calendar on these dusty slopes, only smoke from crude hearths and the clang of bronze tools shaping post holes for huts. The settlement is modest, a scattering of dwellings, a wooden palisade, livestock bleeding inside temporary pens. Yet, in the minds of its founders, those roughly squared timbers already cast the long shadow of marble forums, triumphal arches, and aqueducts arching like stone rainbows across valleys. You overhear Romulus swearing an oath to welcome outsiders, runaway slaves, refugees from neighboring tribes, exiles fleeing vendettas, because manpower is as precious as iron. Soon a patchwork of languages echoes between the hills, creating a civic identity, not of blood purity, but of shared allegiance. You realize the Romans' famous pragmatism is visible right here. If destiny requires numbers, destiny gets them, no matter how mixed the stock. Night falls over the nascent city, and you sit beside a communal fire where elders recount the tale you have just witnessed. Only now it glints with embellishment. Aeneas becomes a larger-than-life hero who converses directly with gods, the she-wolf, a divine omen rather than a fortuitous scavenger. You notice how storytelling itself becomes a form of governance, solidifying norms, justifying hierarchies, binding disparate peoples to a single narrative thread. The letters S, P, Q, R have not yet been carved into standards, but their spirit is already present. An idea that Roman power flows from both Senate and people, working in perpetual tension. As sparks float upward, you sense how these myths provide moral oxygen, feeding the conviction that Rome is chosen, favored, and therefore entitled to expansion, not as aggressor, but as a guardian of ordained order. Dawn's first light silvers the Tiber, and you walk the ridge again, surveying a countryside stitched together by old tribal rivalries and new trade routes. You're struck by how every decision, welcoming the dispossessed, forging marriages with rivals, treating myth as marching orders, equips Rome with a toolkit of adaptability. That resourcefulness, you'll soon see, will let the city survive Etruscan kings, civil strife, and foreign invasion. For now, though, you breathe in the mingled aromas of sheep dung and wood smoke, aware that these humble scents are the prologue to marble grandeur. The city is a promise whispered rather than shouted, yet it vibrates with an energy you can almost touch, as though the ground itself anticipates legions stomping across continents. Before you return to the present, you glance over your shoulder at the flickering campfires, the wolf banner flapping in a faint breeze, and the silhouette of Romulus outlined against a rising sun. You recognize that whether or not every element of the legend is factual matters less than the lesson it imparts. Rome's identity is forged in resilience, inclusion, and a relentless refusal to accept defeat, even from the jaws of mythical beasts or the hands of kin. As you step back through centuries toward your screen, you carry with you the hum of that audacious spirit, ready to witness how it will swell into armies, laws, and roads that claim the known world. You barely have time to wipe the Palatine dust from your sandals before the years leap forward like sparks caught in a sudden gust. The handful of huts you saw at dawn has swelled into a true town, its 7 hills now laced together by timber bridges, earthen ramparts, and a growing sense of purpose. As you wander the winding lanes, you can almost hear the heartbeat of a community sorting out who it wants to be. Shrines crown every ridge. Priests trace sacred boundaries with plowshares. Traders haggle over salt and olives hauled in from rough coastal roads. Yet a single question hovers in the morning air. Who will steer this restless energy toward greatness? You meet the answer in a line of kings, each one adding a new thread to the city's tapestry. First comes the stern warrior you already know, Romulus, crowned by acclamation of the people he has welded into a tribe. He is flint and iron, quick to raise walls and quicker to lead raids against neighbors who still sneer at Rome's upstart ambitions. But when he disappears in a storm of thunderbolts, the mantle of power passes to a man as different from him as night is from day. Numa Pompilius greets you in simple wool, eyes half closed as though listening to voices only he can hear. Under his gentle guidance, Rome learns to lay down its swords at least long enough to honor the gods. You watch him establish the office of Pontifex Maximus, anchor the chaotic lunar calendar, and teach a city of soldiers to become a city of citizens, mindful that divine favor must be earned through ritual, not seized by force. Then, like a pendulum, Rome swings back toward war. Tullus Hostilius strides onto the stage, armor clanking, determined to remind the world that the wolf's descendants still bear fangs. You stand at his shoulder on the battlefield of Alba Longa, where triplet gladiators clash on behalf of their cities in a duel meant to spare thousands. When victory comes, it is brutal and absolute. Tullus razes the rival town and drags its survivors into Rome, doubling the population overnight. You feel the city swell with new blood and with new tensions as the conquered bring their traditions, resentments, and skills inside Rome's gates. Ancus Marcius follows, equal parts builder and diplomat. He teaches you that war and peace are not opposites, but tools, each useful when wielded at the right moment. Under his eye, the wooden Pons Sublicius spans the Tiber, and the salt road leading out to Ostia becomes Rome's first artery to the sea. Grain arrives in quantities that would have seemed impossible in Romulus's day, and with it, foreign luxuries, amber from the Baltic, frankincense from Arabia, stories whispered in Punic, Greek, and Etruscan accents. You sense Rome's destiny ripening, but you also sense its envy of the sophisticated north, where Etruscan city-states glitter with painted tombs and rooftop terracotta. That envy draws an ambitious outsider to the throne. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan with a Tuscan lilt, ascends amid murmurs that a foreigner has no right to wear the purple. He wins skeptics by thinking bigger than any ruler before him. You walk with him along the shallow valley between hills as he sketches a vast arena where chariots will thunder before roaring crowds, the Circus Maximus. He channels civic waste into a grand underground drain, the Cloaca Maxima, transforming a fetid marsh into future prime real estate. Rome, once mocked as a cluster of sheep pens, begins to look and smell like a capital. Yet the city's greatest leap is ushered in by Servius Tullius, a king of mysterious birth. Some claim he was once a slave whose hair caught fire without being burned, an omen of divine favor. Whatever the truth, you watch him survey every household, counting citizens and tallying their property in the first Roman census. Classes are organized not by ancestry, but by wealth, forging a pragmatic link between military duty and political voice. Shields clang as men learn they will march in centuria according to what they can afford to equip. rich cavalry in gleaming bronze, poorer infantry in humble leather. Meanwhile, stone walls rise around all 7 hills, a visible declaration that Rome no longer sees itself as a village. It is a city expecting siege because it fully intends to survive one. But ambition has a darker face, and it finally steps forward in the form of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquinius the Proud. From your vantage point beneath the half-finished columns of the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, you see him cement power with calculated cruelty, nobles executed on the slightest suspicion, taxes wrung from farmers until they curse the harvest, public works completed by forced labor. The Senate grows timid, the people restless. Under a noon sun hot enough to make marble sweat, Tarquin's son Sextus forces himself upon the virtuous matron Lucretia, sparking outrage that crackles through every alleyway. You attend the aftermath as Lucretia, weeping in front of her family, plunges a dagger into her own chest rather than live with dishonor. Blood darkens her tunic an instant before she crumples, and you hear the collective gasp of onlookers solidify into fury. That fury finds its orator in Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who once feigned foolishness to survive the king's paranoia. He lifts the dagger before the crowd, swearing by Lucretia's spilled life and by the gods that never again shall a single man rule in Rome. You can almost feel the air itself stiffen as citizens echo his oath. Within days, Tarquin and his brood are driven into exile. The gates clang shut behind their fleeing retinue. In their place rises an entirely new experiment. You stand in the comitium as Brutus and his ally Collatinus accept office not as kings, but as consuls, 2 equals, each holding the power of veto over the other, elected for a single year, to prevent the rot of tyranny from taking root again. The transformation is swift yet profound. Royal purple is packed away. Ivory scepters are replaced by the humble wooden fasces, symbolizing magistrates who serve at the people's pleasure. The word you hear on every tongue is libertas, freedom, but its meaning is complex. Freedom for patrician houses to debate policy without fearing a monarch's axe. Freedom for citizens to choose their leaders, at least from among the elite. Freedom for Rome to shape destiny without bowing to foreign influence or a despot's whims. In practical terms, it means long days spent listening to arguments in the Senate, where venerable heads hash out treaties, budgets, and declarations of war. It means annual elections in the Forum, ballots scratched onto shards of pottery, while candidates flash togas whitened with chalk to prove their purity of intent. You soon learn, however, that a system forged in reaction can carry its own seeds of conflict. The new republic is a house with only half its rooms furnished. Patricians dominate both consulships and senate benches, while the vast majority, the plebeians who till fields, build roads, and bleed in battle, have scant formal voice. Murmurs grow in back alleys and army camps alike. If Rome truly belongs to its people, why are so many locked out of the conversation? Yet for the moment, triumph eclipses grievance. News of the king's expulsion travels fast, carried by merchants and migrants far beyond the Tiber. Neighboring monarchs bristle, fearing that Rome's example might encourage their own subjects to revolt. Thus, the young republic fights to defend itself from without and to define itself from within. You march alongside hastily raised legions, their standards emblazoned with the fresh motto, Senatus, Populusque Romanus, Senate and People of Rome, an unbreakable partnership declared in bronze and conviction. When victory celebrations erupt, After staving off an Etruscan attempt to restore Tarquin, you sense the city's confidence crystallizing. On the Capitoline, sacrifices smoke before Jupiter, and the cheers that echo across the valley are not for a king, but for an idea. Power shared, limited, yet strong enough to stand against tyranny. As twilight paints long shadows between the columns of the new forum, you understand how far Rome has traveled from the she-wolf's den. The shift from monarchy to republic is more than a political makeover. It is a statement about human agency. Here, in dusty sandals and sweat-stained tunics, ordinary citizens claim a stake in shaping tomorrow. They may not yet grasp how turbulent that stake will become, how bitter the struggles over equality and ambition. But for this moment, they rejoice in a sense of ownership, as though the very stones beneath their feet now belong to every Roman who dares to dream bigger than the last. You leave the square, hearing a chorus of voices, some bold, some anxious, all determined, that will echo down centuries. The wolf's descendants have learned a new trick. They have traded a master's collar for a pair of scales, precarious but full of promise. And as you step back toward the present, you realize that the tension between order and liberty you've just witnessed will power Rome's next great leap, propelling it beyond its hills toward a destiny neither gods nor men can yet fully see. The first dawn after the king's expulsion still feels electric in your memory, but years rush onward, and Rome quickly discovers that freedom is a fortress with doors flung wide. New minted consuls barely finish chalking their names on the calendars before enemy scouts appear on every horizon. Etruscan princes eager to restore Tarquin, Latin towns gauging how far the wolf cub will stray, hill tribes ready to raid undefended fields. You stand on the crest of the Janiculum as crimson smoke spirals from signal fires, realizing that a republic can't simply survive inside its walls. It must reach outward, secure the passes, and make potential invaders its partners, or its subjects. So begins the city's habit of defensive expansion. You march with citizen soldiers whose shields still bear the dents of last year's campaign, across streams that will someday be bridged by stone, toward neighboring strongholds whose wooden gates creak at your approach. At first, the wars feel like skirmishes, a raid on the Volsci over stolen cattle, a quick foray against the Equi to rescue captured merchants. Yet, with every season of fighting, Rome learns a sharper lesson. A colony planted on captured land becomes a buffer against the next attack. A treaty that grants Latin rights to defeated foes ensures fresh recruits for future legions. What looks like conquest is, in Roman eyes, practical insurance. Extend the frontier far enough, and the capital itself sleeps soundly. While spears clash outside the Pomerium, social friction heats the streets within. You wander the forum on market day, and hear plebeian farmers grumbling that they bleed for victories but reap little reward. Grain prices rise while patrician estates swallow bankrupt homesteads. When a veteran shackled for debt collapses in the square, his body scarred by the consul's last triumph, outrage explodes. Plebeians stream out of the city, setting up camp on the sacred mount, and vowing they will neither fight nor farm until their voices matter. You follow them, feeling the tension tighten like bowstring until patrician negotiators arrive, robes dusty, promises eager. Out of that standoff emerges a radical invention. Tribunes of the plebs, ordinary citizens armed not with swords, but with the power to shout, "Veto!" and halt any decree that harms their class. Yet a single concession can't mend centuries of hierarchy. The struggle becomes a decades-long dance. Step forward, slide back, fought with petitions, walkouts, and sometimes makeshift barricades. You stand beneath the rostra as tribunes read aloud the freshly engraved 12 tables, their iron letters glittering in sunlight. For the first time, Roman law is carved in public sight, stripping away the patrician's monopoly on secret precedent. You hear mothers recite statutes on inheritance. Debtors tally exactly how many days before a creditor may seize collateral. Teenagers joke about the fine for insulting a magistrate during a festival. Transparency, you realize, is itself a weapon. When everyone knows the rules, abuse grows riskier. Beyond the walls, the wars scale up. You tramp through dense oak forests of Etruria toward Veii, Rome's wealthy rival perched on a lava bluff. A 10-year siege tests every trick the engineers can devise, mines snaking under ramparts, battering rams cloaked in wetted hides, nighttime sorties guided by moonlight on bronze helmets. When Veii finally falls, the loot pours down the Cassian Way, painted vases, carved ivory, and, most importantly, land. Much of it is parceled to soldiers who have nothing but calloused hands and hope. Each new allotment deepens loyalty to the city that granted it. Victories, however, invite stronger opponents. Southward rise the Samnite highlands, their warriors nimble on rocky slopes where Roman legions slog. In 3 long wars, you follow manipular cohorts that learn, often the hard way, to fight in flexible checkerboard formations instead of unwieldy phalanxes. At the Caudine Forks, you taste the bitterness of forced surrender, walking under the yoke of enemy spears, humiliation scorching your cheeks. Rome answers, not with despair, but with roads. The Via Appia rolls straight through marsh and mountain, carrying fresh troops and faster supplies. Stone milestones appear like silent promises that setbacks are temporary, mobility permanent. Inside the city, the plebeians press their advantage. New offices, aedile, praetor, even one of the annual consulships, open to candidates outside the old clans. You attend elections where men once barred by birth now campaign under canvases strung between temples, shaking hands with artisans, recounting battlefield heroics, and pledging fairer grain laws. Bit by bit, the Republic's machinery becomes more inclusive, not out of idealism alone, but because expansion demands manpower, and manpower demands buy-in. As the census climbs past the 100,000 mark, the Senate authorizes more centuries, more legions, more voices that cannot be ignored. Your sandals carry you to the southern tip of Italy, where Greek marble gleams in sunlit theaters and philosophers debate under plane trees. There you witness Pyrrhus of Epirus, bold, brilliant, and unlucky, landing with war elephants that terrify horses and thrill onlookers. 2 costly victories later, he mutters that another such win will ruin him. When he sails home, the boot of Italy lies firmly under Roman control. Colonies at Beneventum, Brundisium, and Tarentum anchor garrisons and anchor hope. The sea beyond shimmers with possibility, and the world across it begins to look less like foreign turf and more like the next frontier. In the forum, you overhear senators argue how to integrate the peninsula's mosaic of peoples: Oscans, Umbrians, Lucanians, Sabellians. The answer, as always, is pragmatic. Some communities receive full citizenship, their men voting in tribal assemblies. Others gain partial rights, exempt from certain taxes in exchange for troops. A few remain allies bound by treaties that can be rescinded the moment they falter in duty. You notice that Rome rarely erases local customs. Instead, it overlays them with Latin titles, Roman magistrates, and the lure of eventual promotion. Assimilation is offered as a ladder, not imposed as a cage. Amid this whirl of campaigns and compromises, a mindset crystallizes. To be Roman is no longer solely a matter of patrician pedigree. It is a contract signed in service and sealed by the prospect of advancement. You can taste that shift in the taverns where veterans swap tales and accents from every hill town, in the solemn silence of newly naturalized citizens casting their first votes, in the pride of colonists carving SPQR onto fresh milestones hundreds of miles from the capital. Flexibility becomes a form of strength, allowing Rome to knit victory and dissent into a single garment that can stretch without tearing. As twilight settles over the newly paved forum, torches flicker against arches, bearing names of triumphs from places that once seemed impossibly distant. You reflect on how far the city has marched, from the fragile compromise that birthed tribunes to the road-latticed peninsula that now bows, willingly or not, to Roman command. Yet even as celebrations echo beneath triumphal standards, you detect an undercurrent of anticipation. The peninsula is secure, but horizons have expanded too. Traders whisper of rich islands across the Tyrrhenian Sea. Senators study maps of coastlines where rival powers patrol. The machine built to conquer Italy is only warming up. You leave the bustle with a final glance at the lofty Capitoline, its temples glowing amber under torchlight. The republic you first saw proclaiming freedom now wields a different banner, unity through inclusion and incessant motion. Conflict, social or military, has not broken Rome. It has tempered Rome into something more adaptable than any single king could have imagined. And as you step back toward the present, you carry the hum of legions striking camp, the clatter of votes counted under lamplight, the quiet resolve of a people who have learned that security and opportunity are forged on the same anvil, and that neither is ever enough for long. You hardly finish brushing the Italian dust from your cloak before a briny breeze off the Tyrrhenian Sea tugs at the hem, whispering of riches that lie beyond the horizon. Merchant galleys crowd the wooden piers at Ostia, their decks piled with Spanish silver, Sicilian wheat, and strange purple shells from distant Phoenician coasts. As you watch crews shout orders in half-understood dialects, one name keeps bobbing to the surface like driftwood: Carthage. The great North African port glitters just across the waterway, its tall harbor walls lined with warships and warehouses, stuffed with incense, ivory, and memories of ancient Tyre. Until now, Rome's ambitions have marched on land. Suddenly, they must learn to sail. You join a Senate session where seasoned generals sit beside engineers scribbling hull dimensions on wax tablets. The debate is raucous, but the logic is clear. Control of Sicily, the grain basket floating between Italy and Africa, means security and supply. Carthage already garrisons the island's western cities. Rome backs rebellious Greek strongholds in the east. Skirmishes turn into sieges, and the Republic finds itself fighting its first war beyond sight of the Apennines. What Rome lacks in seamanship, it compensates with audacity. You stand on a cliff near Messana as carpenters copy a captured Punic quinquereme plank by plank, then attach a pivoting gangway called the Corvus, a boarding bridge that transforms every sea battle into a land melee where legionary discipline shines. The first great clash at Mylae sends splintered oars swirling in the surf, but Roman marines storm Carthaginian decks with a ferocity learned on Samnite ridges. Victories pile up, losses almost as many. Storms wreck entire fleets, budgets groan under the weight of replacement timber, yet the Senate refuses to quit. You witness citizens donating jewelry and casting the metal into new rams. Even consular sons row alongside convicted debtors. After 2 decades of grinding stalemate, Rome finally seizes the high ground above Lilybaeum, and Carthage sues for peace. The treaty strips its navy, empties its treasury, and hands over Sicily, soon followed by Sardinia and Corsica, when Carthaginian mercenaries revolt back home. Suddenly, Rome owns stepping stones all the way to Spain. The Republic's first provinces are born, but wounds fester on both shores. In North Africa, a fierce general named Hamilcar Barca vows that his city's humiliation will be temporary. You trail him across the straits to the rich mines of Iberia, where he drills a new army and teaches his eldest son Hannibal that Rome is an enemy sworn by God and blood. When Hamilcar falls in battle, Hannibal inherits not only the command, but an oath pronounced before the altar: he will never be a friend to the wolves of the Tiber. Back in Rome, you hear anxious senators tally the silver flowing from Spanish mountains into Punic coffers and realize that another reckoning looms. It comes with shocking speed. Hannibal besieges Saguntum, a Roman ally south of the Ebro, then leads an army of Africans, Spaniards, and snarling elephants over the snow-capped Alps, a feat so audacious many Romans dismiss the reports until they see Gaulish scouts galloping into the Po Valley. You march beside green recruits at the Trebia and watch them break under a flanking charge of Iberian cavalry. You listen to the screams of drowning legionaries at Lake Trasimene, swallowed by morning fog and Punic ambush. When news reaches Rome that 70,000 men have fallen at Cannae, whole families tear their tunics in the form and prepare for siege. Yet the city refuses to surrender. The Senate grants extraordinary powers to Fabius Maximus, whose delay and harass strategy trades glory for attrition. You accompany him as he shadows Hannibal's foragers, burning crops and bribing allies away from Punic banners. Meanwhile, a charismatic prodigy named Publius Cornelius Scipio wins victories in Spain, slicing Carthage's lifeline of silver and recruits. You feel the momentum shift when Ilipa falls and Iberia is lost. You smell it in the incense wafting from temples where citizens thank the gods for survival. Finally, Scipio sails to Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall its wandering avenger. The showdown unfolds on the dusty plains of Zama. Elephants trumpet and charge, but Roman horns blare and mandibles part like iron gates, luring the beasts through corridors of javelins before closing in behind. You watch Hannibal's veterans lock shields with legionaries who have spent a decade learning from every mistake, every ambush, every winter camp. By sunset, Carthage kneels. The peace terms sever its overseas holdings, slash its fleet to a handful of patrol boats, and impose an indemnity so heavy it chains the city's ambition for a generation. Rome, by contrast, stands as master of the Western Mediterranean, its flag, SPQR, rippling over islands once thought beyond reach. But triumph breeds appetite. Traders lobby for new footholds in Greece. Senators daydream of Syrian spices and Egyptian grain. Meanwhile, Carthage slowly claws back prosperity via commerce, enough to unsettle elder statesmen who remember the smoke of Trasimene, a hawkish bloc led by Marcus Porcius Cato ends every speech with the same gravel-voiced refrain. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. When the North African city retaliates against Numidian raids without Roman permission, diplomats present the Senate's ultimatum: abandon your walls and move inland. Carthaginians, incredulous, resolve to fight. You witness the Third Punic War from siege trenches cut into salt, bitter soil. For 3 grinding years, Roman soldiers batter breaches, repair their own lines against desperate sorties, and watch flames devour storehouses until famine turns defenders into specters. At last, Scipio Aemilianus orders a general assault. You follow legionaries clambering over broken ramparts, street by street, house by house, while civilians plead in tongues that have echoed across amphora-lined docks for centuries. The final stand concentrates in the Bursa citadel. When it falls, Carthage becomes a mausoleum. Fires smolder for days, and Roman engineers drag plows across the ash, cursing the soil, though memory, like seed, is hard to kill. Back home, victory parades clog the Via Sacra with silver plate, exotic animals, and captured standards. Yet beneath the trumpets, you detect a harsher rhythm. Tens of thousands of slaves flood the market, their labor cheap enough to displace free farmers who once formed the backbone of the army. Immense estates, latifundia, spread across fertile plains, worked by chains instead of citizen calluses. Senators who enrich themselves on war contracts now lounge beneath painted porticos, while veterans return to find their plots swallowed by creditors. In taverns you hear men mutter that conquest abroad has bred poverty at home. Still, for the moment, the Republic basks in unprecedented power. Rome's navy polices sea lanes from the Balearics to Crete. Its governors tax provinces that had never heard Latin a generation earlier. Amphitheaters rise in provincial capitals, aqueducts march across arid valleys, and Roman law begins to supplant local codes with a promise, sometimes hollow, of order and opportunity. You can taste the sense of destiny thick in the air, as though Mars himself has declared the Mediterranean a Roman lake. But you also sense a new restlessness, a feeling that the old Republican framework groans under the weight of far-flung dominion. As you stroll the forum at dusk, marble glows rosy beneath torchlight and echoes with competing shouts. Tribunes demanding debt reform, equestrians lobbying for more contracts, patrician conservatives fearing that generosity will drain the treasury. Statues of the war dead cast long shadows across flagstones, and you realize Rome has entered an era where enemies abroad are no longer the only threat. Wealth, inequality, and political ambition now march within the pomerium itself. You step away from the celebrations, hearing both the roar of triumph and the low murmur of grievance. The wars against Carthage have forged an empire in all but name, but they have also forged expectations of land, of influence, of unprecedented authority that cannot be satisfied by the modest traditions of citizen farmer legislators. The wolf has devoured a lion and grown too large for its den. As you return to the present, you can still smell the salt air of burned harbors and the faint, unsettling scent of opportunity curdling into unrest, knowing the city's greatest battles may soon be fought not on foreign soil, but in the heart of Rome itself. You return from the smoke-choked ruins of Carthage to find the streets of Rome louder than any battlefield you have marched across. Markets overflow with Sicilian grain, yet beggars sleep beneath freshly gilded porticos. Senators glide past in litters borne by slaves captured on 3 continents, while dispossessed veterans huddle against the Temple of Castor, clutching discharge papers worth nothing without land. You sense that Rome's greatest conquest has exposed an old fracture. The city still praises the small freeholder who fights for hearth and forum, but latifundia, stitched together by war profits, now sprawl across Italy like a suffocating cloak. Olive groves and vineyards, once tilled by families, are worked by chained Carthaginians who never learned Latin, and every wagon load of cheap produce rolling over the Via Appia pushes citizen farmers another step toward ruin. Amid this tension strides Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a young aristocrat whose lineage gleams with triumphs, yet whose eyes linger on ragged tunics rather than purple hems. You stand with him on the rostrum, one breezy spring morning, when he lifts a scorched soldier's helmet to the crowd and asks where the owner might plant olives after years of service if every acre of public land has been swallowed by a few noble houses. His voice, steady but urgent, calls for enforcement of an old law limiting how much ager publicus any citizen may hold, redistributing surplus plots to landless Romans in parcels large enough to anchor a plow, yet small enough to bind them to the Republic. Cheers echo off basilica walls, fists pump skyward. But behind the columns, you glimpse toegate silhouettes whispering about property rights, precedent, and the delicate balance of patronage they have spent lifetimes weaving. Tiberius, recently elected tribune, wields the people's veto like a hammer. When the Senate tries to redirect an unexpected bequest from Pergamum into its own coffers, he proposes funding the Land Commission instead. He dismisses fellow tribune Marcus Octavius, an unprecedented move after Octavius blocks the bill. Though legal gymnastics support the maneuver, it tastes to the Senate like tyranny wrapped in plebeian rhetoric. Still, surveying veterans queuing for allotments along the Tiber, you feel a pulse of hope. Perhaps justice can be brokered within the old Republican forms if someone dares stretch them. Yet hope rarely escapes unchallenged. On election day, for a consecutive tribunate, a custom long frowned upon, rumor spreads that Tiberius intends to grasp even more authority, maybe lifelong office. Senators seize cudgels and chair legs, surge from the curia, and storm the Capitol line. You are nearly trampled as the mob smashes through the voting assembly. Tiberius raises a hand, not in attack, but to signal danger, and that gesture is twisted into proof of monarchical ambition. Clubs descend. When dust settles, the tribune of the people lies lifeless among more than 300 supporters, his body dumped into the Tiber like refuse. A chill settles over the forum. The Republic has witnessed its first bloodshed, born not of conspiracy, but of open political rage. The Land Commission limps on without its champion, handing out lots amid mounting legal wrangling. 2 years pass in uneasy stasis, until Gaius Gracchus, younger brother to the slain reformer, steps forward. You recall him as a boy, pacing behind campaign banners. Now he strides into the tribunate, armed with his sibling's charisma and a lawyer's precision. Where Tiberius swung a single blade, Gaius brandishes a whole arsenal. Price-controlled grain rations to steady the urban poor, military clothing provided at state expense to lighten the burden on recruits, judicial reforms shifting corruption trials from senatorial juries to equestrian panels, and colonies overseas to which surplus citizens might emigrate and thrive. He even proposes extending parts of the civic franchise to Latin allies who who bled beside Romans at Beneventum and Zama, yet still lack a vote within Rome's walls. You watch the Senate's reaction oscillate between alarm and improvisation. Consul Fannius bans unauthorized Italians from the city to mute support for citizenship. The patrician elite sponsors its own idel to distribute free meat at festivals, turning welfare into spectacle. Statues of conservative heroes sprout in the forum like defensive ramparts of marble. But for almost 2 years, Gaius's momentum feels unstoppable. Laws pass, roads lengthen, grain queues shorten. In public, children of both orders recite his measures. In private, older nobles warn that a republic steered by plebiscite alone will capsize. The turning point arrives on the Janiculum during a tense assembly about founding a colony at Carthage's former site. Omens prove unfavorable. Skeptics claim sacred chickens refuse to eat. Whether superstition masks politics, the mood curdles. A scuffle between Gaius's supporters and an opposing herald L. The turning point arrives on the Janiculum during a tense assembly about founding a colony at Carthage's former site. Omens prove unfavorable. Skeptics claim sacred chickens refuse to eat. Whether superstition masks politics, the mood curdles. A scuffle between Gaius's supporters and an opposing herald leaves the latter dead. The Senate seizes the excuse to issue a senatus consultum ultimum, an emergency decree urging consuls to protect the state by any means. You trail detachments of armed equities as they chase reformers through moonlit alleys. Cornered on the Aventine with a handful of loyal retainers, Gaius declines to be captured. Tradition says he ordered a slave to take his life. Either way, his head is severed and weighed for bounty in molten gold, an obscenity that sparks gasps even among victors. Dawn after the purge smells of iron and incense. The reform laws are dismantled piecemeal. Grain subsidies survive, partly because Rome now fears the crowd more than the ledger. Land commissioners are reassigned, files quietly shelved. Yet something irreversible has happened. By resorting to murder under the banner of legality, Rome's ruling class has shown that violence is now an accepted instrument inside the Pomerium. You walk the forum noticing new porticos of polished stone, but also new eyes, hardened by cynicism. The plebs have learned that popular sovereignty can be beaten to death. The Senate has learned that emergency decrees bypass courts faster than any veto. Both lessons will echo. Meanwhile, deeper currents swirl. The Italian allies, having glimpsed the possibility of the vote, will not soon forget the door slammed in their faces. Veterans still drift back to find estates fenced off by absentee senators. Slaves outnumber citizens in some countryside districts, guarded by overseers whose whips are quicker than the nearest magistrate's jurisdiction. You overhear retired centurions complaining that plantations have made them strangers in the villages they once defended. In taverns, ambitious young nobles calculate whether popular assemblies might catapult them to glory faster than senatorial ladders. As you pace beneath the towering victory columns, you sense the ground itself is shifting. The Republic retains its elections, its augurs, its lictors with bundles of rods, yet each institution feels slightly hollowed, its authority contingent on whoever musters the greater crowd, or the sharper blades, on any given morning. The funerals of Tiberius and Gaius, accompanied by sobbing matrons and silent veterans, linger like storm clouds, reminding every Roman that reform attempted through statute alone can be crushed by men convinced They embody the state. Years later, historians will debate whether the brothers failed by pushing too far, too fast, or whether they simply revealed a sickness already terminal. Standing there in that moment, you only know that Rome has crossed a threshold. The city that once prided itself on compromise now keeps fresh bloodstains beneath newly minted paving stones. Where a king's arrogance once shattered monarchy, an elite's fear has cracked the republic's veneer of civility. And as you turn away from the shadowed Aventine toward the distant glint of legionary standards marshaling for fresh campaigns, you cannot shake the suspicion that swords raised against citizens today will carve paths for warlords tomorrow, and that the Republic's gravest battles have shifted from fields abroad to the corridors of its own power. The echoes of the Gracchi tragedies have barely faded when you notice a different kind of restlessness sweeping through the forum, one measured not in petitions or speeches, but in the tramp of hobnailed sandals and the clatter of armor. Rome still calls itself a republic of laws, yet its future now seems to balance on the talents and tempers of men who command armies rather than assemblies. You first feel the shift on a dusty plain in Numidia, where a cunning chieftain named Jugurtha buys senators as easily as horses. The Senate hesitates, but an ambitious plebeian general, Gaius Marius, vows to end the stalemate. You watch him recruit destitute volunteers who own no land, drilling them into professionals, loyal not to property, but to the hand that promises plunder and pensions. Their new pilum-throwing formations smash Jugurtha's guerrillas, and the soldiers chant Marius's name as though it were a civic oath. Back in Rome, crowds grant him successive consulships in breezy defiance of tradition, proving that urgency and charisma can rewrite the rules more efficiently than any tribune's bill. Marius's victories earn parades, but they also unleash expectations. When Germanic Cimbri and Teutones pour over Alpine passes, panic jolts the Senate into handing him command again. You march beside his legionaries at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae, where the air rings with the clash of iron and guttural war cries. Marius's hardened ranks hold firm, delivering slaughter so complete that riverbanks clog with shields and corpses. Rome hails him as its third founder, yet under the laurel wreath you sense weariness in aristocratic eyes. A single citizen wielding so much popular devotion feels uncomfortably close to a king in all but crown. Meanwhile, tensions at home explode. Italian allies, long promised citizenship for their blood and taxes, finally rebel in what will be called the Social War. You ride through central Italy watching towns that once raised Roman standards now mint their own coin, stamped with the goddess Italia. Marius helps crush the revolt, but the Romans, recognizing the futility of denying the inevitable, extend citizenship anyway, proving that rights sometimes arrive only after musket smoke clears. The new citizens quickly fill legion ranks, giving commanders an even larger reservoir of allegiance to exploit. Enter Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician whose icy discipline contrasts sharply with Marius's battlefield bravado. Together, they defeat King Mithridates' forces in Greece, but triumph breeds rivalry. When the Senate decrees that Marius, not Sulla, will lead the next Eastern campaign, Sulla does the unthinkable. He turns his legionaries toward the city they swore to defend. You watch them march through the Servian gate, scarlet cloaks stiff with dust, standards glinting in grim sunlight. Senatus consultum ultimums flutter uselessly as citizens scramble for doorways. Blood spills on marble floors, and precedent shatters. Legions can now decide legislation. Sulla departs for Asia Minor, leaving Rome gasping. Marius, old but unbroken, returns with supporters and unleashes reprisals just as savage. The streets filled with heads posted on the rostra, proof that political disagreement has devolved into curated terror. When Marius dies, Sulla races back, crushes Marian factions at the Colline Gate, and assumes the title dictator for making laws and restoring the Republic. You stand in the Forum as wooden tablets listing proscribed enemies are nailed to the basilica walls. Senators, equestrians, even old neighbors marked for death and asset seizure. The executioners earn commissions. The Republic loses more of its soul. Yet amid the carnage, Sulla codifies courts, strengthens the Senate, and limits the tribunate, hoping parchment can restrain future strongmen better than senators ever did. After 3 years, he resigns power voluntarily, an act intended as noble example but remembered mostly for demonstrating how easy seizing absolute control had become. No sooner does Sulla retire to his villa than new contenders step forward. A youthful Pompey wins early fame hunting down the last Marian holdouts in Spain, earning the sobriquet Magnus after Alexander. Marcus Licinius Crassus, richest man in Rome, buys and bullies his way to command, extinguishing Spartacus's slave revolt and crucifying 6,000 rebels along the Appian Way. Each claims devotion to republican norms while amassing private armies and private fortunes. To keep ambitions balanced, the Senate reluctantly grants them and a rising politician named Julius Caesar a joint consulship deal, cementing an informal alliance later dubbed the First Triumvirate. You watch Caesar, charming and relentless, secure the proconsular governorship of Gaul. The post seems a backwater until he turns it into a launch pad for conquest. For nearly a decade, you trek behind his cohorts through forests dripping with mist, across rivers swollen with snowmelt, and over wind-swept beaches facing the chalk cliffs of Britain. Dispatch after dispatch reaches Rome, recounting victories over Helvetii migrations, Germanic warlords, and rebellious Gallic chieftains like Vercingetorix. Each report arrives with wagon loads of gold, exotic captives, and glorified narrative crafted to magnify Caesar's genius. His soldiers adore him. Their spoils fund games and public works that win hearts of the urban plebs. Senators grow uneasy. Pompey, meanwhile, consolidates his own base in the capital, overseeing grain supply and rebuilding temples. When Crassus's ill-fated expedition against Parthia ends with his head stuffed into an actor's prop in a Persian theater, the balance collapses. Rome now hosts 2 titans, but only one theater of power. The Senate, urging Pompey to safeguard the state, commands Caesar to disband and return as a private citizen. You stand on the northern bank of the Rubicon in winter drizzle, hearing the mutter of legionaries, unsure whether they will march home or into treason. Caesar, cloak pulled tight against the chill, steps across the shallow water and utters a gambler's proverb, Alea, iacta est. The die is cast. In that instant, every law forbidding an armed commander's entrance into Italy becomes parchment torn by iron. You follow the column southward as town after town opens its gates, some out of fear, others out of loyalty bought with years of booty. Pompey evacuates to Greece, senators in tow, while Caesar seizes Rome without unsheathing a sword. Civil war ignites on battlefields from Pharsalus to Thapsus to Munda. You witness evening camps where veterans who once drank from the same skin Now sharpen Gladia for dawn's assault. At Pharsalus, Caesar's outnumbered legions break Pompey's ranks with a sudden reserve flank, turning seasoned aristocrats into fugitives, scrambling for ships. Pompey dies in Egypt. Caesar pursues dreams of wider monarchy, penning clemency speeches even as he tightens his grip over coinage, courts, and colonies. Senate benches fill with new men grateful for his patronage. Statues depict him crowned in laurel, and murmurs grow that he intends to crown himself outright. You feel tension crackle during the festival of Lupercalia, when Mark Antony publicly offers him a diadem. Caesar refuses, yet the gesture rings ominous in a city allergic to kings. A conspiracy forms among senators who once fought on opposite sides, united now by fear that the Republic's heartbeat is slowing beneath Caesar's purple-edged toga. On the Ides of March, you stand near Pompey's theater as blades flash beneath marble porticos. Caesar falls at the foot of a statue of his old rival, blood pooling where senators hoped dignity might return. Instead, chaos storms in. Antony brandishes the bloody garment before a stunned crowd. Caesar's will leaves gardens and coin to commoners, citizens riot, and conspirators flee for their lives. You realize the lesson hardly needs stating. Each time Rome tries to cure personal ambition with exceptional power, the dose grows larger and the patient weaker. Sulla's dictatorship begot proscriptions. Caesar's reforms begot assassination. Legions now measure legitimacy more than laws do, and the Republic's institutions, once supple enough to absorb crisis through compromise, have become brittle. The city that once exiled its last king for overreach has given birth to leaders whose authority eclipses monarchs, while still wrapped in Republican vocabulary. As you step back toward the present, the Tiber's slow current feels like a metronome counting down to a finale already scripted by ambition, loyalty, and the momentum of armies that no Senate decree can reverse. You still taste iron in the air as you slip from the portico where Caesar's body lay. Yet almost immediately, the city forces you to remember how much of daily life the fallen dictator had already rewired. The sun that rises over the Tiber does so according to his brand new calendar. Its months realigned so farmers know when to sow and magistrates know when their terms truly end. Grain ships unload in freshly dredged basins, financed by his Egyptian windfall, and plebeians stroll past temples whose columns display marble he sent from Carrara at state expense. Everywhere you look, projects begun under his sweeping cura re publicae tell you that a single will has, for a brief moment, bent traditions older than stone. Walk into the forum, and even the architecture whispers his ambition. A half-finished basilica bears his family name. Bronze plaques listing senators now stretch to 900 entries after he doubled their ranks with provincial elites whose loyalty mattered more than birth. Glance up the Capitoline, and you notice vacant pedestals awaiting statues of planned provincial patrons, an artful reminder that Rome's center of gravity had started sliding toward a Mediterranean commonwealth. At street level, veterans in Gaul-stamped tunics queue for land deeds in Corinth and Carthage, new colonies meant to thin Rome's unemployed masses while seeding outposts of Caesarism across the sea. Yet the most profound change is invisible, an expectation that one decisive mind will arbitrate disputes faster than any committee. Merchants praise tax remissions arranged in minutes instead of months. Debtors bless laws capping interest and forgiving arrears of the urban poor. Jurists admire the draft for a codex that might have standardized the jumble of edicts cluttering courtrooms. Even many nobles, wary but pragmatic, accepted his perpetual dictatorship as the price of stability after years of prescriptions and civil campaigns. So, when you replay the Ides of March, daggers flashing between marble columns, you realize Brutus and Cassius did not merely assassinate a man, they tried to excise a habit already seeping into the civic bloodstream. In the weeks after the murder, Rome learns that killing a leader is simpler than reviving a system. Senators drape temples in black, but crowds gather at Caesar's pyre, wailing as if a father has been stolen. You squeeze through smoke-thick streets and hear orators recite the will. Every citizen promised 300 sesterces, the groves across the river gifted as public gardens. Men who yesterday muttered about tyranny now clutch wax tablets doing sums. And when Antony lifts the blood-stained toga during the funeral oration, you feel the mood turn molten. The mob uproots benches, brandishes burning brands, and hunts conspirators who fancied themselves saviors. In a single afternoon, the common folk decide that, republic or not, they preferred predictable favors to rumors of restored liberty. Beyond immediate rage lies confusion. Power, once lattice-worked through assemblies, censors, and augurs, now converges on whoever can claim Caesar's mantle. Antony secures official documents left under seal, announcing he will execute the dictator's unfinished decrees, effectively wielding a dead man's signature like a continuing edict. Lepidus camps legions on the city's edge, offering muscle in exchange for priesthoods and provinces. Meanwhile, a slender 19-year-old arrives from Brundisium, calling himself Caesar's heir and presenting the slain ruler's signet ring. You hear his birth name, Gaius Octavius, whispered in cautious clusters. But soon, placards simply read, Caius, Julius Caesar, Octavianus. Letters patent confirm what the ring implies. The dead dictator has adopted him posthumously, and the law treats that adoption as fact. Inside cramped insulae, gossip splits along lines of hope and fear. Some citizens imagine Octavian might embody Caesar's benevolence without Antony's swagger. Others worry that any heir, however polite, must eventually tighten the fist. What unites them is skepticism that the Senate can reassert genuine primacy. Even Cicero, rallying eloquence like an aging gladiator, raises a dulled blade, spends more time maneuvering Octavian against Antony than laying out a sustainable constitutional cure. You realize that the forum once famous for balancing ambition with precedent no longer speaks a common language. Each faction cites the mos maiorum only to mask maneuvers rooted in military calculus. Across the empire, governors hesitate, unsure which signature, Antony's red wax stamp or Octavian's fresh seal, will pay their legions. In Cisalpine Gaul, Decimus Brutus refuses to cede command and finds himself besieged. In the east, Cassius and Brutus gather volunteers by promising a war on tyranny, yet fund it with forced loans that smell like the very exactions they condemn. You watch grain merchants hedge bets by shipping consignments to both rival ports, and temple priests delay festivals until it's safer to gamble which portrait belongs on the next sacrifice. Meanwhile, the reforms Caesar launched prove surprisingly resilient, precisely because they serve practical needs. The Julian calendar ticks on. Provincial governors keep using the streamlined census model. Artisans still rely on the stable silver coinage he minted. Even conspirators leave those systems untouched, knowing any disruption would brand them saboteurs of daily bread. You start to suspect that the dictator's true monument is neither the Forum of Caesar nor the statue planned on the Quirinal, but an administrative machinery now indispensable to friends and foes alike. Yet, such machinery demands fresh oil, funds, decrees, judicial decisions that only living authorities can supply. Octavian, leveraging youthful earnestness, persuades 2 legions to follow him with promises of justice for his father. Antony, invoking battle-tested camaraderie, convinces veterans he alone safeguards their promised pensions. Within a year, both men march armies south of the Rubicon, each claiming to protect Rome from the other. The Senate, which once exiled Tarquins to preserve republican dignity, now authorizes whichever commander stands at its threshold with the larger escort. On dawn patrol outside the Colline Gate, you study new banners embroidered with Caesar's comet, the supposed soul of the dictator blazing in the heavens during his funeral games. Octavian wields that image like divine notarization. The gods ratified Caesar's rule. Therefore, they bless the air. Coins soon circulate bearing the star above his head, and in taverns, people trade them like talismans. You have little doubt superstition dovetails neatly with ambition, but you also see genuine longing for cosmic order after years of political whiplash. Even so, whispers persist that if Caesar's death could not restore the Republic, perhaps it signposted its demise. Rural veterans muse that Rome has outgrown assemblies suited for a city-state. Merchants negotiating tariffs in Antioch, curse delays caused by indecisive commissions, and soldiers, tough, practical, far from home, care less about constitutional nuance than about donatives, fertile plots, and a general who remembers their names. Watching campfires flicker across the Italian plain, you sense that the question is no longer whether one man will consolidate power, but which man will do it, and with what narrative. As you step away, the Tiber flows midnight black, mirroring torches lining the half-completed temple of Venus Genetrix. Caesar dedicated that shrine to the mythical ancestress of his line, merging private pedigree with public cult. Now its scaffolding creaks in the night breeze, a perfect emblem of Rome itself. Grand plans paused, destiny uncertain, yet no going back to the modest contours that once defined a republic of citizen farmers. Whether Octavian, Antony, or some unforeseen rival claims the scaffold's ribbon, you understand the structure taking shape will be something new. Not the shattered republic, not a naked monarchy, but a hybrid whose steel will be forged in the furnace of the civil wars yet to come. You don't wait long before events race beyond speculation. One spring morning, word arrives that Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus have met on a lonely island in the Reno River, far from spies and senatorial parchment. There, you're told, they sealed a compact by sacrificing a boar, a ram, and a bull, an old-fashioned rite for a startlingly modern bargain. They emerge as legally sanctioned triumvirs for the restoration of the Commonwealth, armed with consular imperium and a 5-year mandate to crush Caesar's enemies. You realize the Republic has just outsourced survival to 3 shareholders who command more legions than the Senate can muster scribes. Their first order of business is not a foreign war, but a bookkeeping of blood. Prescription lists appear on the Basilica Julia walls, names inked in neat columns, senators, equities, creditors, even personal rivals slated for death and asset seizure. You watch desperate Romans scan the tablets, hands trembling as they search for fathers, brothers, or patrons. Cicero's name looms largest, and you stand helpless as bounty hunters track him to a leafy villa south of Formiae. When his severed head and eloquent hands are nailed to the rostra, the very platform where he once condemned Antony, you grasp that oratory, however brilliant, cannot outshout steel backed by armies. The purge achieves its grisly aim. The treasuries refill. Loyalty is terror-tested, and the Triumvirate funds an expedition east where Brutus and Cassius marshal forces under banners proclaiming liberty, yet financed by forced levies. You sail with Octavian's flotilla across the Adriatic, seasick on rolling decks, crowded with veterans promised land grants in Italy's richest valleys. The opposing armies finally collide near Philippi in Macedonia, a battlefield of marshy gullies and dusty ridges that will decide whether Republican memory still has muscle. The fighting comes in two pulses. In the first, Antony punches through Cassius's flank, even as Brutus overruns Octavian's camp and captures the heir's empty litter. Cassius, blinded by dust and incomplete reports, mistakes partial defeat for total disaster and orders a freedman to run him through. You walk the moonlit field later, hearing Antony remark, perhaps sincerely, that the day has robbed him of a better enemy. 3 weeks later, the armies meet again. Brutus's line buckles under Antony's relentless cavalry, and the last defender of senatorial idealism falls on his own sword. His followers scatter toward Thrace, but few outrun the recruiters of slavery. Rome's civil wars are not finished, yet the cause of Brutus and Cassius is. Back in Italy, veterans demand the homesteads Octavian pledged. You witness city councils receive marching orders to evacuate farms, olive groves, entire hamlets, so that triumphant soldiers can plant new roots. Dispossessed locals watch their orchards measured by surveyors' rods. Resentment smoldering into the Perusian War, led by Antony's fiery wife, Fulvia, and his brother, Lucius. Octavian, frail in health but ruthless in calculation, starves the hilltop town of Perugia into surrender, then allegedly executes its senators by lottery before an altar to Caesar the divinized. Pleading tablets baked in Perusian clay beg for mercy that never comes. You pocket one shard as a reminder that domestic policy now wears a general's boots. The triumvirs renew their pact at Tarentum, trading ships for infantry, and extending their legal stranglehold another 5 years. Yet, cracks widen. Lepidus, sidelined to Africa, grows irrelevant, while Antony drifts east, bewitched by horizons where Alexander once marched, and by the magnetic presence of Cleopatra VII. You accompany his caravan through the Cilician gates into Tarsus, where the Egyptian queen arrives on a perfumed barge, its silver oars beating time to flutes. Romans who once mocked Eastern excess now find themselves dazzled. Antony, styling himself Dionysus reborn, stages triumphs in Alexandria, grants lands not yet conquered to Cleopatra's children, and marries her by Egyptian rites. Rumors back in Rome congeal into fear that a second capital is gestating on the Nile. Octavian exploits every whisper. He reads aloud Antony's will, liberated from the Vestal vaults, claiming it leaves rich bequests to the queen and orders burial in Alexandria. Crowds who once cheered Antony now brand him traitor. The Senate, herded by Octavian's oratory and bribery, strips Antony of powers. Priests declare Cleopatra a sorceress corrupting Roman virtue. War is not declared on a citizen. That would violate sacred custom, but on the foreign queen who bewitches him. You sense the brilliance of the ploy. Octavian frames civil conflict as patriotic crusade. Armadas converge near the Greek promontory of Actium on the evening of the Egyptian New Year. You watch Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, outmaneuver heavier but less cohesive enemy triremes, chaining maneuverable squadrons into crescents that choke Cleopatra's line. When her royal flagship hoists sail and flees south mid-battle, Antony's cohesion dissolves. Torchlight flickers across bronze-clad rams embedded in shattered hulls. The sea, thick with tar-soaked smoke, tastes of salt and ash. By dawn, the War of Alexandria is as good as over, though 2 more years will pass before Antony, cornered in a mausoleum he built for triumphal pageants, falls on his sword, and Cleopatra chooses a venomous asp over humiliation in a Roman parade. Octavian enters the Egyptian capital cautiously, keen to secure grain fleets and royal treasure. You walk behind him through marble colonnades where Greek philosophers once lectured. He refuses the king's diadem offered by courtiers, but accepts the Golden Throne's bullion melted into legionary pay. Pragmatism cloaked as modesty. Returning to Rome, he closes the doors of the Temple of Janus, signaling universal peace under his watch, and announces that all exotic spoils belong to the Roman people. Yet he alone controls their distribution. The Senate, exhausted and diminished, heaps titles upon him: Princeps, Senatus, Imperator, eventually Augustus, the revered one. Each honor masks reality. He holds authority as perpetual consul, proconsular governor of a dozen provinces, and commander of every legion therein. Still, he performs humility with genius. During sessions, he speaks first, but dresses like any senator. In games, he sits among citizens, only slightly elevated. He revives republican magistracies, but schedules elections, so his nominees glide in unopposed. You understand that the last civil war did not replace the republic with open tyranny. It installed a monarchy camouflaged by meticulous etiquette. What matters to most Romans is results. Piracy vanishes from sea lanes. Roads sprout mile markers from Gaul to Judea. Veterans settle on fertile plots from Seville to Beirut. Temple facades gleam after marble revetment programs. Poets celebrate a golden age of Latin verse sponsored by imperial friends. Even the calendar now bears his imprint. The month Sextilis is renamed August in his honor. Popular memory of prescriptions and famine dims beneath amphitheater spectacles paid from Egyptian treasure. You pass a new Arapatis, an altar to peace, where reliefs depict the imperial family in procession among symbols of abundance: cornucopias, acanthus scrolls, toddlers tugging on togas. Yet beneath the polished veneer, you glimpse the fine print of allegiance. Legions swear oaths to Augustus personally. The Praetorian Guard camps within a morning's march of the Forum. Provincial governors rotate frequently to prevent fiefdoms. Census data flows into a single set of wax tablets in the treasury, rendering revenue an exact science and descent a traceable risk. Laws against adultery and ostentatious luxury remind elites that moral authority underwrites political power, and Augustus defines morality. Standing on the Capitol line at sunset, you watch bronze doors reflect a sky the color of burnt gold, and realize the Mediterranean's once competing sovereignties now orbit one man's prudently veiled supremacy. The wolf that devoured the world has finally found a master, though he pretends to be merely its shepherd. As torches flare along the sacred way, and the city settles into the first deep peace it has known in generations, you sense history exhale. Yet you also note how quickly peace becomes expectation, and expectation can curdle into entitlement. For now, though, Roads are safe, granaries full, and the man at Rome's helm is careful to share the spotlight with the goddess Fortune, a public nod to chance even as he writes destiny with deliberate hand. You linger on the Capitoline long enough to feel dawn steal across the rooftops, washing statues and colonnades in pale gold, the same hue that now colors nearly every thought in Rome. Under Augustus's careful choreography, mornings begin with predictable rhythms. Clerks unlocking the public treasury, scribes unrolling census charts, lictors clearing paths for magistrates whose togas advertise a hierarchy consciously polished, never pulverized. You notice how effortlessly people speak of res publica restituta, the republic restored, yet everyone's eyes flick toward the Palatine, where a single household governs policy as discreetly as a household priest tends a shrine. What once felt like conquest now resembles orchestration. Walk the forum, and you'll sense that orchestration everywhere. When builders swing mallets on the Temple of Mars altar, they work from architectural plans Augustus sketched to remind citizens that vengeance for Caesar's murder underwrites present peace. Nearby, artisans carve friezes of twin boys suckled by a she-wolf, anchoring divine lineage to state messaging. Yet the loudest proof of new order is silence. No mobs chanting for grain, no veterans rioting for pay. That's because Egypt's harvest now sails reliably into Ostia's harbors, and a single edict makes late shipments a matter for imperial agents rather than senatorial debate. Even the price of bread feels inevitable, set by algorithms scribbled in the notebooks of appointed prefects. Travel a day's ride down the Appian Way, and you'll see the same pattern repeated like tesserae in a mosaic. Milestones etched with Augustus's titles double as reminders of standardized units, ensuring wagon axles match road gauges from Tarraco to Tarsus. Post stations staffed by imperial slaves swap exhausted horses for fresh in minutes, letting urgent messages outrun any rumor. Veterans settled in colony grids plow rectangular fields with agrarian tools, subsidized by loans from the Aerarium Militare, the new military treasury funded by inheritance taxes. Augustus persuaded the Senate to pass for the good of the legions. The subtle brilliance is that everyone pays, but soldiers know exactly whom to thank on payday. Civic loyalty, however, is not forged by logistics alone. In theater porticos, shaded from Mediterranean glare, you watch Horace debut odes praising moderation while subtly endorsing imperial stewardship. In tucked-away gardens atop the Esquiline, Virgil rehearses passages of the Aeneid for an audience that includes both young nobles and their tutors. The poem's hero endures storms, wars, and heartbreak before founding a line that culminates in Augustus himself, a neat moral repeated until it feels historical. Attendance at poetry readings becomes a marker of cultured citizenship, as essential as voting once was, except the ballot box has been replaced by applause for verses that sanctify political reality. Cross to the northern frontier, and the tone hardens. Along the Rhine, legions erect palisades and timber watchtowers under centurions whose vine staffs discipline as swiftly as they tally supplies. You share a meal of coarse bread and garum with recruits fresh from newly annexed Gaul. They remark how little pay shortages matter when merchants follow fortresses offering wine, wool, and wives. Yet, beyond the river, dense forests swallow Roman ambition like a bog consumes a spear. You're there when Publius Quinctilius Varus leads 3 legions into Germania, trusting treaties inked with the Cheruscan prince Arminius. 3 days later, storms roar, Roads dissolve into mud, and ambush cries churn the canopy. You scramble through fog and oak smoke, hearing Latin commands drown beneath barbarian horns. By the time remnants straggle back, Rome's impeccable facade sports its first public crack. Augustus, learning of the massacre, reportedly beats his head and begs Varus to return the legions he has lost. The empire reacts with fortifications, not retreat. Stones rise into walls that skirt river bends, watchtowers punctuate ridgelines. Auxiliary cohorts of Batavians and Thracians swell payrolls. You realize the key lesson. Setbacks do not dethrone Augustus. They validate why his vigilance must endure. Inscriptions on altar bases proclaim rerum gestarum, the deeds accomplished, while quietly implying many more remain unfinished. Back in the capital, the question of succession circles every banquet like incense smoke. The emperor, acutely aware that restored republics rarely survive lawless inheritance fights, experiments with potential heirs. You witness him promote youthful Marcellus, then lay adoption papers on Agrippa, his longtime fixer, before settling on stepsons Tiberius and Drusus. When Drusus dies from a horsefall on the German frontier, Tiberius alone shoulders the mantle, a tacit promise that the system will outlive its designer. Senate sessions rehearse the transition in slow motion. Tribunes propose honors, senators decree them. Augustus declines extravagant titles while accepting crucial powers. It's a play staged annually until the audience forgets it is theater. Meanwhile, domestic reforms drill deeper. The Leges Julia police marriage, penalize adultery, and reward fecundity. Policies advertised as moral revival, but also convenient for ranking households by reproductive allegiance. You attend trials where eminent men forfeit estates over affairs that once merely filled gossip scrolls. Some whisper that the new laws reveal an old anxiety. A dynasty requires legitimate heirs, but ordinary Romans notice simpler metrics: streets lit by nightly patrols, firefighting brigades dousing kitchen blazes before they consume insulae, public health regulations flushing waste through the cloaca maxima toward fresh drainage basins. Culture absorbs this regimen of order and optimism with surprising elasticity. Musicians adapt Greek modes to Latin lyrics. Sculptors soften Hellenistic muscle into portraits exuding civic gravitas. Even provincial elites mimic the style. In distant Emerita Augusta, Spanish notables commission an amphitheater whose arches echo the Colosseum's precursor, linking local pride to imperial blueprint. You grasp that Rome is becoming less a place than a toolkit. Walls, roads, fountains, forums, statues of victory, all reproducible in marble or basalt, each imprinting loyalty through familiarity. Yet if you pause amid the hum of achievement, you'll sense an undercurrent of guardedness. The Praetorian Guard now occupies a fortified camp east of the city wall, their gilded shields both protection and reminder. Senators debating grain tariffs glance at those walls before voicing dissent. Poets, whose metaphors veer too near political critique, discover invitations to visit Chili Tomis on the Black Sea, as Ovid does after his enigmatic Carmen et Error. Rome's golden age gleams, but it casts a calculated shadow. When Augustus falls ill in Nola, you take note of the methodical choreography. Couriers speed to Rome. The Senate receives sealed packets confirming Tiberius's imperium. The guard rings the city, but keeps swords sheathed. Word of the emperor's death reaches the populace only after the machinery of transition hums smoothly. Days later, his body lies in state beneath the field of Mars, surrounded by alabaster candles whose flames flicker against triumphal reliefs of Parthian standards, surrendered without a fight. A potent image. Enemies bow to diplomacy, backed by legions. As pyre smoke spirals into a twilight shot through with cinders, an augur points skyward, and gasps ripple through the crowd at the sight of a comet. Seldom seen, yet now inevitable in memory. You realize Rome has refined celestial marketing into a rite. First Caesar's star, now Augustus ascending among the gods. Tiberius, reserved to the point of frost, kneels nonetheless, pledging to guard the people just as diligently. The Senate votes divinity for the departed and grants his widow Livia the title Augusta, cementing a matrilineal branch in the political vine. Walking away, you recognize that the empire Augustus forged is more than a military dominion. It is a psychology. People expect roads to be repaired before winter, assume grain will sell at fixed prices, and trust that distant wars will rarely reach Italian soil. Even as they grumble about taxes or scoff at moral edicts, they subconsciously inhabit a world he curated, one where the term civil war feels like a cautionary relic, not an imminent threat. You pause on the Milvian Bridge, watching barges carry marble upriver for yet another temple restoration funded by the new princeps. The sun lowers behind Janiculum Hill, turning the Tiber coppery, and you understand that continuity itself has become Rome's greatest monument. Augustus taught the city to crave stability as passionately as earlier generations chased glory. Whether that craving will withstand bureaucratic calcification, volcanic upheavals, or the ambitions of future emperors remains unknown. What's certain, as torches flare and the night patrol calls orders synchronized with water-lapping pilings, is that the Republic lies embalmed within an empire that claims to resurrect it every dawn, preserved, revered, and utterly transformed. You leave the Milvian Bridge believing the machinery of Augustus's empire will glide forever, but the Tiber's slow eddies remind you that even polished marble erodes. Within a year, the city learns how quickly serenity can curdle into suspicion. Tiberius prefers Capri's sea caves to Senate debates, governing by letter, while Praetorian prefect Sejanus consolidates influence in Rome. When rumors of a coup surface, Tiberius orders a purge that threads through equestrian salons and patrician dining rooms alike. You see senators, once confident beneath Augustus's benign gaze, now glance over shoulders at every cough of sandal on mosaic. The lesson sinks in. Continuity depends less on laws than on the nerves of whoever wears the signet ring. Not all successors stumble so darkly. In Nero's early reign, architects finished the Aqua Claudia, and musicians tune hydraulos pipes for festival crowds. Yet his later extravagance, an actor emperor gilding his own statue, torching segments of the city for a palace garden, convinces you that inherited power can warp faster than it solidifies. After Nero's suicide, armies in Spain, Syria, and the Rhine elevate rival generals in a single dizzy year. Legions that once marched east together now trade blows outside Cremona, burning granaries meant for barbarian campaigns. The empire survives, but the facade of unshakable order cracks like a fresco in winter frost. The Flavian dynasty steps in with a pragmatic repair work. Vespasian taxes everything from public latrines to North African olive oil, funding the Colosseum that now towers where Nero's artificial lake once glittered. You stand in its shadow as crowds roar at staged sea battles, sensing civic pride recalibrated through spectacle and mortar. Yet, it's his son, Domitian, who instills a quieter change. Pay for frontier troops arrives on time. Currency keeps good silver content. The empire, though wary of his autocratic flair, recognizes that competence can hide behind a stern brow. Then an assassin's blade in the imperial bedroom flips destiny once more. Senators, suddenly kingmakers again, choose an aging jurist named Nerva, childless, mild, respected for moderation. He adopts the popular General Trajan, launching a precedent that will define an era, emperors choosing successors for talent rather than blood. You watch Rome exhale as adoptive succession transforms anxiety into expectation. When Trajan rides into the city from the Rhine frontier, citizens cheer not lineage, but merit. Under his rule, ambition reawakens. Stone-ribbed bridges leap across the Danube. Legionaries in testudo formations batter Dacian hill forts until King Dictatorship lies dead beside a poisoned brook. Thousands of pounds of captured gold flow down the Via Traiana, financing grain doles, harbor basins at Ostia, and the brick-red markets of his namesake forum. You tilt your head far back to read the spiral reliefs of Trajan's column. Ranks of soldiers, river gods surrendering, engineers throwing pontoon bridges like ribbons across currents. The empire now stretches from the Scottish lowlands to the Persian Gulf. Geography so vast, the parchment map looks swollen to its frame. Prosperity invites fresh ideals. Hadrian, Trajan's adopted heir, decides that holding borders beats outrunning them. You accompany him on tireless inspection tours, marvel at archers drilling under blistering Syrian suns, trace the damp mortared rampart rising across Britannia's heathered moors. In Athens, he funds libraries and a marble-glinted temple to Olympian Zeus, whispering to admirers that Greek wisdom deserves a renaissance under Roman stewardship. At home, he reshapes the legal code so provincial governors can reference edicts without shuffling contradictory scrolls. Still, whispers follow him about the cost of stone walls and lavish philanthropy. Some senators mutter that an emperor wandering so widely risks losing Rome itself. Antoninus Pius, mild and methodical, inherits coins bearing Hadrian's blunt profile and ensures they remain true silver. His reign feels almost weightless. No major wars, no tax surges, barely a ripple in the grain price. The Senate, pampered with courtesy, raises temples to conquered rather than courage. You stroll through suburban villas where retired centurions grow grapes beside imported roses, their grandchildren reciting Catullus under tiled colonnades. It seems the world Augustus imagined has finally matured, a Mediterranean bloodstream circulating goods, law, and letters, with a pulse so steady few notice the strain. Strain arrives in the form of parchment dispatches stamped with unfamiliar tribal symbols. On the northern rivers, restless federations, Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, probe for weakness, driven by chain reactions of migrations deeper in the Eurasian interior. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, closes his copy of Zeno and dons a general's sagum. You follow him into the alpine snows, where field tents double as writing desks. At night, he drafts meditations beside guttering braziers, reminding himself that virtue persists, even when fingers cramp around a stylus. Victories come, but they no longer pay for themselves. Each new campaign invoice forces a senatorial vote to debase the denarius just a whisper more, stretching silver with copper so payroll chests still clasp shut. Inside Rome, marble still gleams, but you catch artisans diluting whitewash, landlords subdividing apartments, imported pepper and silk rise in price. Tax collectors tighten ledgers in outlying towns. Yet public order holds, thanks partly to a new buffer. Antoninus had built a second wall in northern Britain. Hadrian's rampart had been garrisoned more thickly. And now, Marcus seeds client kings along every vulnerable frontier. The empire learns to trade subsidies, grain ships, embossed helmets, Roman titles, for peace, a cheaper defense than outright conquest, but one that mortgages tomorrow for calm today. Even so, the good still outweighs the worrisome. Roads remain safe enough that a merchant can leave Baetica with amphorae of olive oil and arrive in Mainz weeks later to find Gallic buyers quoting the same imperial measures. Doctors in Pergamum dissect medical texts stamped with Alexandria's library seal. Glassblowers in Colonia Agrippina imitate Syrian styles. The empire's cohesion, though expensive, still feels inevitable, like tides or solstices. Marcus tries to ensure continuity by elevating respected governors as potential heirs, but love for his only surviving son, Commodus, eclipses policy. You watch the 13-year-old stand beside him in a triumphal chariot, broad-shouldered, sun-flushed, promising in silhouette. Soldiers swarm the viewing stands, chanting his name. Senators trade uneasy glances, reminiscent of earlier dynasties whose sons undid fathers' labors. Marcus, weather-beaten and weary from plague-ravaging border camps, ignores doubts and prays philosophy, and duty will flower in the boy's conscience. He dies in a Pannonian headquarters, wrapped in wolf pelts beneath a canvas roof that flaps against sleet. Commodus inherits legions grown accustomed to hardship, and a treasury stretched by frontier construction and plague burials. You return to Rome, sensing a gust of uncertainty sharper than any since Nero's torchlit nights. Statues of the good emperors line the forum like sentinels, carved from a fading ideal, each face serene, each plinth a reminder that selection by virtue had delivered an apex of order. Yet those marble eyes cannot advise the young man now descending the Palatine steps in a lion skin cloak, eager to refashion power in the image of personal appetite. As twilight bleeds into lamp-lit streets, you weigh the decades you've witnessed. The empire reached its zenith by adopting rulers who treated it like a stewardship rather than an inheritance. It also expanded administrative sinews, roads, codes, walls, robust enough that ordinary life could flourish while the imperial court revolved overhead. But the very size and complexity that ensured prosperity now demand resources no victory can replenish cheaply, and the experiment of choosing emperors for merit balances on the whim of one untested heir. You step away, haunted by two opposing truths. Rome has never felt more integrated, and its margins have never felt more fragile. Whether the next generation sustains the hard-won harmony or squanders it in gladiatorial vanity will determine if these stone capitals remain a beacon for centuries or erode into footnotes of what might have been. You watch Commodus stride into the Colosseum, wearing a lion skin and wielding a gilded club, eager to reenact Hercules, while Rome's engineers hurry outside the arena, patching aqueduct leaks and tallying rising grain costs. It feels as though the young emperor is whistling to drown out a rumble in the distance. The treasury he inherits is thin from decades of frontier fortifications and plague relief, yet he spends it on marble colossi of himself and cash prizes for courtiers who praise his marksmanship. Every coin struck with his smirking profile contains less silver than the one before, a quiet devaluation that merchants notice long before senators dare whisper it. When Commodus falls to a wrestler's garrote on New Year's Eve, the city barely exhales before spiraling into an auction. The Praetorian Guard literally sells the throne to the highest bidder. And suddenly, you understand how fragile meritocratic succession always was, dependent on discipline that dies with the disciplined. A rapid-fire carousel of emperors follows, parades of hopeful faces, each promising restoration while hurriedly minting coins to pay the troops who lifted him up. Civil war sparks across the Rhine, Pannonian and Syrian frontiers, encouraging tribes to test palisades they had previously respected. You ride with a Gallic legion that must abandon its posts to march on Rome for a pretend liberation, leaving hinterland villages to fend off raids. In the east, a sun-baked caravan town called Palmyra supplies Rome with desert glass and spices. Its prince Odenathus, and later his widow Zenobia, step into the security vacuum by forging their own client empire stretching to Egypt. On the Rhine, a charismatic officer named Postumus declares a Gallic empire, striking coins that still salute Rome while quietly diverting taxes to local defense. The Mediterranean's political mosaic fractures into three competing sovereignties that all brand themselves Roman. The armies, overstretched and underpaid, learn dangerous lessons. When emperors encourage soldiers to loot rebellious provinces, the habit sticks. Commanders grow loyal to paymasters rather than principals. One officer, Septimius Severus, wins a civil war by promising every trooper an enormous donative. Afterward, he doubles the army's official wage, then debases the denarius again to fund it. You can almost hear inflation hiss through marketplaces. Bakers demand twice the sesterces for a loaf to keep pace with rising wheat prices. Parents bury coin hoards in clay pots, hoping silver content will someday stabilize. The state attempts a shortcut. Caracalla extends full Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the empire, ostensibly a gesture of unity, but practically a way to widen the tax base. Provincial elites celebrate new legal status, then open ledgers to calculate what they now owe. When plague revisits from the east, funeral pyres flicker along every major road, and labor shortages push estate owners to lock tenant farmers in place with hereditary obligations. Peasants call it a re-enslavement. Landlords call it necessary. Either way, mobility, the empire's engine of commerce, slows. Along the Danube you see legions stitched together from Goths and Sarmatians who were yesterday's enemies, today's auxiliaries, tomorrow's wild card if compensation lags. One towering Thracian named Maximinus seizes the throne without setting foot in the Senate, proving that a soldier's sword now outranks centuries of civic precedent. The simmering chaos boils over in what later generations label the crisis of the 3rd century. Between desertion, assassination, and battlefield mishaps, emperors tend not to outlive festival posters bearing their likenesses. Currency dwindles to bronze discs, washed in thin silver. Merchants revert to barter. Roadside shrines attract pilgrims begging unfamiliar gods for stability. You cross the empire's breadth and count coin-struck portraits of more than 20 emperors in less than 50 years. Enough to make continuity feel like a myth. Yet amid the swirl, individuals capable of brutal clarity emerge. One is Aurelian, a cavalry commander whose eyes burn with exhaustion and focus. He gallops from front to front, smashing the Gallic breakaway in the west and Zenobia's Palmyrene dominion in the east before erecting massive brick walls around Rome itself. An admission that the capital can no longer rely on distant frontiers for protection. He standardizes military rations, realigns the coinage to something approaching honesty, and promotes the sun, god Sol Invictus, as a single celestial patron meant to unite fracturing loyalties. His reign lasts only 5 years before palace intrigue claims him, but he leaves proof that ruthless concentration of force can still glue the shards, if only briefly. Permanent repair waits for Diocletian, a shrewd Illyrian officer who understands that any one man, however talented, will drown in simultaneous crises. He divides the imperial command into a tetrarchy, 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars, each ruling a quadrant of the empire, with its own capital, mint, and mobile field army. You travel the spokes of this new wheel: Nicomedia in Bithynia, Sirmium on the Danube, Trier in the misty Rhineland, and witness provincial courts humming with regional decisions, no longer stalled by Rome's distant bureaucracy. Diocletian doubles the provinces, bundles them into dioceses, and staffs each level with equestrian officials who owe advancement to imperial favor, not senatorial ancestry. The tax system is overhauled so that grain, labor, and coin assessments align with actual harvest cycles, recorded on wax tablets, that accountants seal in lead capsules to deter tampering. Reform comes at a social price. A massive price edict carved on stone slabs sets maximum fees for everything from Egyptian linen to Illyrian oxen, attempting to freeze inflation by decree. Black market exchanges sprout the next day. Military requisition parties compel peasants to sell hay at fixed rates, sowing bitterness that outlasts winter. Religious policy shifts too. Diocletian, a traditionalist, blames Christians for angering the old gods and unleashes empire-wide persecutions. You stand outside Nicomedia's basilica as soldiers rip scrolls from cedar chests and fling them onto bonfires, while the faithful smuggle relics into catacombs, convinced endurance will outlast tyranny. It does, but under a surprising benefactor. Constantine, son of a Western Caesar, marches under a new symbol, an intertwined chi and rho. He claims Christ revealed to him in a dream before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. When his army wins, he issues the Edict of Milan with rival Licinius, granting Christianity legal status alongside traditional cults. You walk through Rome dazzled by the sight of bishops in purple-edged tunics, consulting with praetors on property restitution. Temples to Mithras and Sol still burn incense, but congregations now discuss theology in open markets. Constantine eventually defeats Licinius, reuniting the empire under one ruler again. Yet he does not stay in Rome. Instead, he chooses ancient Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople, a strategic hinge between Europe and Asia, guarded by triple walls and fed by cisterns that can outlast siege. You stroll its broad avenues while marble facades rise at astonishing speed, financed by a special grain dole diverted from Egypt and Syria. Senate benches carved with acanthus leaves ship in from Italy, as if the old city is gradually cloning itself on the Bosporus. Under Constantine, the imperial machine adopts fresh gears. Gold coins, called solidi, restore faith in currency. Military ranks open further to provincial talent. Episcopal councils convene to hammer out creeds because doctrinal unity now parallels political unity. You sense a subtle but profound pivot. Belonging to Rome increasingly means sharing an administrative network and, for many, a faith that claims universality beyond ethnicity or city walls. The empire still speaks Latin in the west and Greek in the east, but clerks file taxes under a hierarchy that views loyalty through spiritual as well as civic lenses. Yet schisms linger. Frontier troops complain that while Constantinople gleams, Rhine forts rot. Senators grumble that converting temples to churches erodes mos maiorum. Pagan philosophers at Athens publish treatises arguing that Rome rose under Jupiter, not the crucified carpenter. Still, the new order holds because it offers more predictability than alternatives. Bishops arbitrate local disputes, Solidus enables long-distance trade again, and Constantine's heirs inherit a political theology as potent as any legion. You leave the fresh-cut limestone dock of Constantinople and gaze westward. Behind you stretches a capital ready to command trade routes that once bankrolled Persian kings. Ahead lies an older Rome, whose grandeur now competes with memory rather than momentum. But from Hadrian's Wall to the Red Sea, milestones still bear the imperial eagle. Tax caravans still roll. Provincial governors still sign edicts under the N, signifying nostri. The empire you have traced from marble infancy to this refounded colossus is neither whole nor entirely at peace. Yet once again it has reinvented itself, threading new faith and new finance through worn sinew. Whether that weave can withstand fresh migrations, religious factionalism, and the unrelenting arithmetic of defense remains an open ledger. But for the first time in generations, hope and administration march in something like step. You step ashore at Ravenna on a chill morning when gulls wheel above pine-fringed marshes and the air smells of brine and wood smoke. Once a minor Adriatic port, the city now hosts the Western Court because its watery approaches frustrate siege engines and its channels can whisk an emperor to sea should disaster appear on the horizon. The mosaicked basilicas glitter inside, but the defensive logic feels stark. Rome herself, with her crumbling Aurelian walls and shrinking population, is no longer judged safe enough for power to sleep. Letters arriving from every frontier reveal why. Across the Rhine, federations of Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, Alemanni, and Franks have swollen into entire peoples on the move, some fleeing Hunnic warlords sweeping in from the steppe. Others, drawn by stories of fertile Italian valleys and tax registers too thin to fund adequate garrisons. Diplomats call them federati and sign treaties granting land in exchange for military service. Farmers living near frontier forts simply call them new neighbors with unfamiliar gods and hungry children. You ride north with a column of limitani posted along the Danube and find stone watchtowers manned by locals who speak rough Latin in the morning and ancestral dialects at night. They wear Roman belts but braid their hair after tribal custom, a living ledger entry showing how identity has become a gradient rather than a border. When a fragile peace ruptures at Adrianople, you watch imperial legions, long the anvil of civilized warfare, shatter under cavalry charges led by Fritigern's Thervingi. The Emperor Valens falls in the melee, and smoke from burning supply wagons drifts south toward Constantinople. The defeat shocks you less than the aftermath. Instead of annihilation, the Goths negotiate settlement inside imperial borders, keeping their own chieftains and laws while promising to defend a realm they just humbled. The precedent is unsettlingly practical, and before long, other groups press for similar arrangements, partnerships born not of conquest, but of mutual exhaustion. Administrative paperwork struggles to keep pace. You sit beside weary scribes in Mediolanum, drafting rescripts that parcel out Tuscan estates to federate allies in lieu of overdue pay, scrolls whose Latin margins overflow with transliterated Gothic names. Treasury officials clap wax seals on agreements they can't enforce west of the Apennines. In the Senate, gray-haired nobles debate whether barbarian generals deserve Roman titles. But outside, the Curia children learn to say rex and comes in the same breath, sensing where real authority gathers. Power gathers, for a time, around Stilicho, a general of Vandal birth who marries into Theodosian blood and commands allegiance from both Germanic mercenaries and Roman regulars. You follow him as he races from Alps to Pyrenees, plugging breaches with hurried diplomacy or swift cavalry. Yet factional jealousy in Ravenna undermines his coalition. Court eunuchs whisper treason, and the young emperor Honorius signs an execution order. Once Stilicho's head tumbles, the fragile tapestry he wove unravels. Alaric, former ally turned adversary, marches his Visigoths down the Italian peninsula almost unopposed, encamping beneath the very walls of Rome. On a late August night, you stand on the Appian Way as gates creak open, perhaps by treachery, perhaps desperation, and history lurches. For 3 days, the Eternal City endures sack. Not the rays and salt of ancient Carthage, but a methodical rummaging for plate, silks, and captives that nevertheless shatters the psychological spell of inviolability cast since Hannibal failed at the gates. The shock travels farther than any army. Provincials in Britannia cease receiving pay chests and notices of reassignment. Left to fend for themselves, they declare local autonomy, planting seeds that will sprout into kingdoms with Celtic tongues and memory of Roman law. In North Africa, a restless coalition of Vandals and Alans crosses from Hispania, seizing Carthage and its grain fleets. Within a decade, the Western court must purchase food at sword point from a polity it once taxed. You watch senators in Ravenna auction heirloom bronzes to hire Hunnic auxiliaries, their villas on the Tiber moldering under overgrown vines. Each workaround buys months, never decades. Meanwhile, the eastern half, centered on Constantinople, tightens its fiscal screws and professionalizes its army under efficient ministers like Anthemius and generals such as Aspar. Gold, solidus from eastern mints, retains weight and purity, luring merchants who shun the West's adulterated coin. You cross the Aegean and feel the contrast immediately. Forums bustle with silk traders from Syria. Shipyards hammer out dromons for Black Sea patrols. Clerks track land taxes down to the fig orchard. The capital's double walls loom confidence incarnate, studded with artillery platforms that deter even Attila's Huns when they thunder across the Balkans. Diplomacy sweetened with tribute redirects many raids toward the west, a grim calculus that preserves one half of the empire by allowing the other to bleed. Yet Constantinople's leaders know containment is impermanent unless theology, coinage, and law align subjects toward a cohesive identity. You attend the Council of Chalcedon, where bishops debate the nature of Christ in phrases sharper than gladii, because doctrine now undergirds loyalty. The resulting creed, hammered out under imperial auspices, aims to align worship from Egypt to Armenia, but also alienates communities that soon raise their own patriarchs and grievances. Religious unity proves as elusive as military security, and the state begins granting bishops civil authority to arbitrate disputes, a pragmatic melding of church and bureaucracy that stabilizes for the moment while planting seeds of future contention. Back in the West, fragmentation accelerates. Successive puppet emperors reign briefly under the shadow of Ricimer, a Germanic warlord who cannot claim the throne himself, but wields king-making clout. When his sudden death leaves a vacuum, Italy flounders until Odoacer, leader of a motley confederation of Heruli and Siri, topples the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus. You witness envoys carry the imperial regalia eastward, surrendering the western diadem to the eastern court for safekeeping, a gesture both symbolic capitulation and acknowledgement that two emperors no longer make sense. The Senate petitioned Zeno to govern Italy indirectly. Zeno, relieved of western liabilities, grants Odoacer the title patricius, effectively outsourcing rule to a barbarian strongman under nominal eastern supervision. Life for ordinary Italians changes less than poets lament. The Annona shipments still arrive, now subject to Vandal goodwill. Tax collectors still knock. Roads still carry pilgrim traffic to shrines standing where pagan temples once thrived. But aristocrats now court Gothic or Burgundian overlords with the same rhetoric once reserved for proconsuls, and youths study both Latin rhetoric and the sword drills of their federate neighbors. Roman law continues to govern land sales. Roman marble still floors basilicas. Yet, the intangible sense of a single Mediterranean dominion has splintered like an aging fresco flaking from damp plaster. You journey north through alpine passes newly controlled by Ostrogothic patrols wearing composite armor that melds steppe lamellae with Roman scale. The king they serve, Theodoric, educated as a hostage in Constantinople, speaks fluent Latin, corresponds with philosophers like Boethius, and commissions aqueduct repairs in Rome, even while his Gothic warriors worship Arian Christianity. He rules as guardian of Roman tradition and exemplar of Germanic might, a living paradox that feels harmonious until his death reveals how personal most compromises remain. By the time you reach the gates of Constantinople again, the imperial court has adopted a new self-description, not merely Roman, but Basileia Romaion, an empire distilled into Greek-speaking Orthodox Constantinople and its Anatolian heartlands. Justinian, an emperor of Balkan birth and Caesarian ambition, dreams of reknitting the sundered limbs. You watch engineers outline the foundations for the Hagia Sophia's soaring dome, even as generals Belisarius and Narses set sail to reclaim Africa and Italy. Mosaic tesserae and cavalry saddles are ordered in equal measure, art and war, yoked to a single vision of restoration. Yet even this resurgence underscores the transformation unfolding from Hadrian's Wall to the Nile cataracts. The empire has survived by evolving, abandoning illusions of indivisible territory, embracing religious sponsorship as statecraft, and tolerating client kings who drape themselves in Roman titles while steering their own cultures. You step onto a dock where merchants haggle over silk priced in solidi, not denarii. You pass scholars translating Aristotle from Syriac into Armenian. You overhear Gothic soldiers debating Greek theology at a wine shop built atop a Roman cistern. The world ringing the Mediterranean remains recognizably Roman in roads, laws, and calendar dates, yet unmistakably post-Roman in the diffuse mosaic of powers that now administer them. Night settles over Constantinople's triple walls, lanterns tracing lines of mortar that held firm where so many others crumbled. You realize the empire's future will hinge not on repelling every invader, but on absorbing, converting, or collaborating with forces once deemed external. The center has bent without snapping, trading territorial uniformity for administrative adaptability. whether that flexibility proves durable against new storms, from Arab horsemen on desert winds to Slavic settlers in Balkan forests, will depend on how well Constantinople can translate Roman legacy into the plural tongues and faiths of a changed world. For now, the moonlight glints on a solidus clasped between your fingers, its imperial bust facing eastward, as though already aware that the sunrise of Rome's endurance now crowns the domes beyond the Bosporus. You stand beneath the new-laid dome of Hagia Sophia, while masons still sweep away marble dust, convinced that Justinian has stitched the Mediterranean back together with mortar and silk. Yet almost at the moment the final gold tessera slides into place, strains begin to show. First comes the plague, buboes blooming in neat soldiers, clerks, water sellers, hollowing work gangs and treasury alike until empty ships bob at neglected quays. Then, the endless wars to defend Italy and Africa demand fresh coin, fresh horses, fresh men. Soon even Constantinople's granaries echo. You realize Conquest has returned the map to Roman lines, but not the manpower or revenue that once animated them. After Justinian's death, the frontiers snap back like overstretched rope. Lombards pour into northern Italy, Persian armies lunge across the eastern marches, and Slavic clans drift down the Balkans, planting villages and valleys once patrolled by legionaries. You ride with the weary strategist Belisarius during his final campaign, and sense how even his famed ingenuity can only delay the inevitable flood. To cope, emperors reshape provinces into military districts called themes, granting land to soldier farmers who must defend it themselves. The arrangement buys resilience at the price of decentralization, and you note how local accents and loyalties thicken as imperial stipends thin. In the 7th century, the Persians strike hardest, overrunning Syria and Egypt, looting the True Cross from Jerusalem and camping within sight of the capital's walls. Constantinople survives because Heraclius gambles everything, melting church plate for coin, marching a lean army through Armenia, and smashing the Persians on their own soil until both empires bleed out. His victory is Pyrrhic. Within a decade, newly unified Arab tribes erupt from the Arabian Peninsula, preaching a faith as portable as a saddlebag and swift as desert wind. They seize Damascus, Alexandria, then the Maghreb, slicing away provinces that once fed Constantinople's tax rolls. You watch imperial scribes draw new borders that shrink like wool in hot water. Yet, the city refuses to yield. Engineers stretch a massive sea chain across the Golden Horn. Alchemists perfect Greek fire, an unquenchable liquid flame you first see arcing from ship prows against an Arab fleet during the Great Siege of 717. Night turns bright as noon, and the besiegers retreat. Convinced angels guard the ramparts. These reprieves allow Byzantium to cultivate a leaner identity, Greek-speaking, Orthodox, heir to Rome, yet distinct. Icons bloom on chapel walls, shimmering faces of Christ and the Theotokos that some emperors later deem idolatrous. Sparking waves of iconoclasm, you witness artisans whitewash mosaics under imperial orders, then, decades later, scrape off plaster and restore the very images their fathers destroyed. The argument is theological, but also political. Which symbols best bind a populace stretched across Aegean Isles and Anatolian highlands? By the 9th century, the empire stabilizes enough for a renaissance under the Macedonian dynasty. You stroll through libraries where scholars in lamplit alcoves copy Plato and Euclid, ensuring Greek learning will outlive turmoil. Missionaries Cyril and Methodius carry a new alphabet to Slavic lands, tying distant converts linguistically to Constantinople. On parade days, you see theme regiments in glittering lamellar march beside Varangian guards, towering Norse mercenaries who trade forest furs for imperial gold. Borders push outward again. Crete reclaimed, parts of Syria contested, Bulgaria humbled after a thunderous victory at Clydion, where prisoners are famously blinded in rows. Each 100th man left one eye so he can lead the rest home. Prosperity breeds complacency. Court intrigue thickens like incense. Tax farmers squeeze peasants. Generals feud while Seljuk Turks probe eastern passes. At Manzikert in 1071, you watch an imperial army crumble when mercenaries switch sides mid-battle and Emperor Romanos IV is captured. Anatolia, the empire's breadbasket, fractures into Turkish beyliks almost overnight, and refugee columns clog the Bosporus ferries. Desperate, the emperor appeals to Latin Christendom for help, unwittingly inviting armies whose piety blends with greed. The First Crusade passes in uneasy alliance, but tensions simmer until 1204, when Venetian scheming and Crusader debt culminate in an assault on Constantinople itself. You stand helpless as bronze horses are pried from the hippodrome, libraries burn, and jeweled chalices become booty in northern cathedrals. The Latin Empire installed afterward rules only the city and thin coastal strips. Inland, successor realms in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond preserve Byzantine traditions, like embers, cupped against wind. In 1261, Nicaean forces under Michael VIII slip through an undefended gate and reclaim the capital. You return to find mosaics blackened, palaces roofless, yet a pulse of determination persists. Craftsmen patch walls, mend aqueducts, and crown Michael with a tiara heavier than the treasury he inherits. But trade routes have shifted to Genoese and Venetian ships. Tax farms now belong to Italian bankers, and the empire survives by negotiating tariffs rather than projecting force. Emperors cultivate diplomacy, dynastic marriages with Serbian princes, tributes to Mongol khans, theological councils courting reunion with Rome. Each gambit buys time, never security. While Constantinople debates doctrine, a new power rises on the Anatolian steppe, the Ottomans mastering siege artillery and absorbing rival beyliks into a disciplined frontier machine. You witness the grinding encirclement. Gallipoli seized, Adrianople renamed Edirne, key forts on the Bosporus lost. The empire, reduced to a few Thracian valleys, resembles a fortified monastery more than a realm. Still, daily life in the city clings to ritual. Candlelit liturgies echo under Hagia Sophia's dome. Scholars debate Aristotle in shadowy courtyards. Merchants hawk silk dyed imperial purple, though fewer buyers can pay the premium. In 1453, the noose tightens. Mehmet II, a sultan barely 21 yet versed in Greek classics and artillery science, drags monstrous cannons across Thrace. You feel their thunder in your chest as stone walls, once proof against catapults, splinter like brittle bread crust. The defenders, a motley mix of Byzantine soldiers, Genoese mercenaries, and volunteers from across Christendom, number perhaps 7,000. Outside, wait tens of thousands. For weeks, you pace the ramparts, heart-stopping each time a section buckles, then soaring when sorties repel janissaries up assault ladders. On the final night, Emperor Constantine XI, clad in crimson, receives communion with peasants and nobles alike, surrendering hierarchy to shared fate. At dawn, the final assault breaks through the Kirkaporta gate. Fighting spills into Hagia Sophia, where civilians huddle, convinced the dome's angels will descend. They don't. When Mehmet enters at midday, he orders his banner raised, but forbids looting beyond 3 days, an act of calculated magnanimity. You watch him walk the nave, scoop a handful of earth, and declare the cathedral a mosque. Yet he leaves its dome intact, recognizing power in continuity. The city, now Istanbul, becomes the jewel of another empire, its streets resonating with muezzin calls, interlaced with lingering church bells. And yet, stepping away, you trace familiar outlines under new stucco. Aqueduct arches still ferry water. Theodosian walls still tame the sea. Greek manuscripts migrate to Italian presses, fueling a Western Renaissance. And the Orthodox liturgy survives in distant Rus lands that will soon title their ruler Tsar, Caesar. Rome's eastern heart stops beating, but its vascular network pulses on, carrying law codes, architectural principles, and philosophical debates far beyond the Bosporus. You realize empire can fall in seconds, yet persist for millennia in the minds, languages, and stonework it seeds. As twilight settles over minarets where crosses once gleamed, you hear merchants still bargaining in a lingua franca peppered with Latin roots, and you feel the paradox of Rome, a world-spanning ambition that outlived every throne it built, echoing wherever roads straighten, domes soar, and people ask how to weave many tongues into one story. You walk away from the shattered gates of Constantinople, certain you have witnessed the last gasp of the Roman story, only to discover that endings in history are rarely so neat. The flames that licked the city's limestone have scarcely cooled before threads of its inheritance begin weaving themselves into new tapestries across 3 continents. You can almost feel them tugging at the hem of your cloak. Monks smuggling gilded manuscripts through Balkan forests. Italian ship captains negotiating lucrative trade capitulations with the victorious Sultan, and Slavic envoys riding north to declare Moscow the rightful heir to the city of Caesar. Rome's eastern heart has been captured, but its pulse migrates swiftly into fresh arteries. Your first glimpse of this afterlife comes in the crowded lanes around the Grand Bazaar, where Ottoman scribes copy imperial charters in a hybrid script, Arabic letters laced with loan words that once rang through the Senate House. Mehmed's chancery calls itself the House of Rum, claiming stewardship of a multi-ethnic legacy stretching back to Augustus. The new rulers measure land in Greek-Roman feet, tax harvests by Byzantine weights, and refurbish aqueducts whose keystones bear Christian crosses, now discreetly plastered. You sense a pragmatic continuity. Conquerors adopt the administrative bones they find, grafting a new religious skin over joints still labeled in Latin or Greek. The Sultan's engineers even preserve the anima cistern to store siege reserves, proof that infrastructure outlives ideology. Meanwhile, Greek scholars stream westward with trunks stuffed full of Plato, Euclid, and Galen. Texts once guarded in Constantinople's libraries. You trace their route to Florence, where a young Marsilio Ficino pores over yellowed folios and translates the Corpus Hermeticum at Cosimo de' Medici's urging. In lecture halls from Venice to Paris, the syllogisms of Aristotle regain clout precisely because refugees pronounce them with an accent shaped by the Bosporus wind. Ancient wisdom, filtered through Byzantine glosses, ignites a humanist bonfire that will soon blaze into the Renaissance. When Brunelleschi sketches domes, he studies the pantheon via treatises preserved by Eastern copyists. When Columbus petitions Isabella, his maps echo, Ptolemy's coordinates reintroduced from Greek originals. You realize the very fall mourned by chroniclers becomes, in another light, a dispersal of intellectual seed. Travel north, and you find the double-headed eagle soaring again, this time above the Kremlin's crimson walls. Ivan III marries Sophia Paleologina, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, and drapes her dowry into Russian court ceremony. Liturgies in Moscow adopt the Constantinopolitan rite. Scribes title the ruler Tsar, a Slavic echo of Caesar, and theologians proclaim the city the Third Rome, destined to keep orthodoxy's lamp burning where old and new Rome failed. You watch ambassadors debate whether lineage or faith legitimizes this claim, but the populist verdict is practical. If Rome once guaranteed order, then any polity that can muster cathedrals and a standing army may inherit its mantle. Even in distant lands, Rome is reimagined less as geography than as transferable prestige. Back along the Adriatic, the small mountain republic of Ragusa styles itself Respublica Ragusina and stamps coins with Latin mottos, arguing that civic liberty descends from Roman municipal tradition. Ragusan diplomats slip between Ottoman pashas and Venetian admirals, using a commercial Latin peppered with Slavic vowels. They remind you that Roman identity has never depended solely on bloodlines. It thrives wherever roads, contracts, and pragmatic tolerance intersect. In those marble arcades, you sense the empire's ghost, efficient bureaucracy, mixed faith communities, and a talent for profiting from rival hegemons rather than defying them outright. The Orthodox Patriarchate, now under Islamic auspices, still appoints bishops from Serbia to Sinai, wielding spiritual authority recognized even by sultans who consider themselves guardians of all people of the book. You attend a midnight vigil in a converted chapel and notice how Greek chant mingles with the distant call to prayer, a sonic proof that the spiritual facets of Rome's legacy adapt to new custodians without dissolving. In legal courts, judges cite Justinian's novellae to settle inheritance disputes between Armenian merchants, testament to a code resilient enough to survive theological and linguistic upheavals. Elsewhere, the civil law tradition, codified in Byzantine manuals, seeps into the statutes of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V's jurists rely on the corpus juris civilis when drafting reforms for territories from the Rhineland to Burgundian Flanders. The fact that Protestant princes and Catholic bishops alike quote a 6th century Orthodox emperor underscores just how secularly valuable that jurisprudence remains. When the Dutch later craft merchant bylaws for their global ventures, those too carry faint imprints of Roman contract clauses about chartered companies and mutual liability. Ship south across the Mediterranean, and you encounter the Mamluk-era port of Alexandria. There, a polyglot harbor community relishes translated Galenic medicine and Ptolemaic astronomy, preserved through Syriac and Arabic commentaries, texts whose continuity the Byzantines once ensured. Islamic physicians, such as Ibn al-Nafis, refine Galen's cardiac theories, while Jewish philosophers in Cairo annotate Aristotle using Greek originals ferried out of Cappadocia before 1453. Centuries of polemic notwithstanding, the intellectual ecosystems of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism share a Roman rootstock. Each quotes, corrects, and extends the corpus, proving that conquest can redirect rather than sever cultural rivers. Even the new Ottoman artillery that toppled Constantinople owes a lineage to Roman metallurgy transmitted through Arab and Balkan craftsmen. Cannon founders use measurements originally derived from Byzantine treatises on bronze casting. Field engineers consult reclaimed copies of Hero of Alexandria's pneumatics before calibrating gunpowder ratios. The battered Theodosian walls thus contribute lessons in their own defeat, a somber but apt metaphor for Rome's habit of instructing its successors through ruins as well as triumphs. Cross the Atlantic with Spanish conquistadors, and you see Roman military vocabulary transplanted wholesale. Centurion becomes centurion, campus morphs into campo, and missionary architects erect cathedrals whose barrel vaults trace lessons studied in Vitruvius. The administrative districts they impose, municipios, provincias, audiencias, mirror Iberian adaptations of late imperial diocese boundaries. New World subjects who never set foot on European soil find their daily life organized by echoes of an empire expired a millennium prior, yet still architecturally and legally omnipresent. Back in Istanbul, Suleiman the Magnificent commissions the chief jurist Ebu Suud to harmonize Sharia with sultanic law, citing Roman flexibility as precedent. Mosques rise on aqueducts repaired with surviving Roman concrete recipes. Palatial courtyards feature semicircular exedrae that would not have looked odd in Diocletian's retirement villa. When travelers like Ogier de Busbecq describe tulip gardens along the Bosporus, they also note milestones still carved with Latin numerals, reused as Ottoman grave markers. Stone forgets no empire. It merely hosts new inscriptions. Stand on a ridge above Sarajevo at dusk, and you hear church bells, minaret calls, and the rumble of a tram line installed by Austro-Hungarians who, in 1898, cite Roman roadbeds when planning rails across Bosnia. Each layer invokes Rome as justification for modern intervention, proof that the brand remains potent currency long after legions vanished. Tourists photographing Hadrian's Wall, pilgrims kissing icons in Mount Athos, coders debugging software named for Roman deities, all operate within a cultural grammar first drafted in the Senate and recopied in the great palace's scriptorium. You realize then that Rome's story after 1453 is less a coda than a kaleidoscope. Its legal logic underwrites continents. Its engineering principles guide skyscrapers. Its rhetorical tropes animate political campaigns. Even digital maps rely on latitude-longitude grids honed by Hellenistic scholars, patronized by Rome, and preserved by Byzantium. Each time someone invokes republic, empire, senate, or citizen, they draw from a well that has never run dry. As you leave the Bosporus shoreline, night envelops domes and minarets alike, but fairy lights flicker like constellations on black water, suggesting roots laid 2,000 years ago. You catch yourself murmuring a line from Virgil, brought to the Ottoman court by a Venetian translator, and smile at the improbable journey those hexameters took. Rome fell many times, to Goths, to Crusaders, to cannon. Yet every collapse proved paradoxically an export event, spreading bricks of law, arches of engineering, and scrolls of thought far beyond the reach of any single emperor's arm. The empire is gone. Its blueprints are everywhere. You step into the glass-walled concourse of a 21st century airport and catch your reflection beside a column trimmed with faux Corinthian capitals, realizing the itinerary that brought you here is written in alphabets, road grids, and legal codes forged 2 millennia ago. As your boarding pass flashes across a scanner, The very word citizen embedded in your passport owes its cadence to Roman law, where civis marked not ethnicity, but a contract of rights and duties. The queue ahead feeds into jetways named after letters that once marched along the Appian Way, and the Annunciator's English sentences carry half their bones in Latin roots: community, security, terminal, international, proof that languages shaped by empire still navigate the world's logistics. When you cross customs, you read declarations framed by scales and fasces engraved above the arch, symbols the modern republic borrows unconsciously from its antique counterpart to signal lawful authority. Outside, highways braid the landscape with a precision Hadrian surveyors would respect. Standardized lane widths, milestone signage, and service areas echo the cursus publicus and its posting stations. You cruise beneath concrete arches, casting shadows reminiscent of aqueduct arcades. Civil engineers still cite the Roman mastery of voussoir load distribution when justifying the elegance of a new overpass. Sensor arrays monitor traffic flow through an algorithm that mirrors the same impulse Augustus applied when he mapped census data to grain shipments. Use information to make movement predictable. Satellite navigation grids, built on latitude and longitude refined in Alexandria, position your car to within a handful of cubits. Even space-age circuitry leans on geodesy, once patronized by emperors seeking to tax provinces accurately. As city skylines rise, you notice how municipal identity brands itself with domes, colonnades, and porticos that would have flattered a Trajan or a Constantine. Courthouses in Buenos Aires, state capitals in the American Midwest, parliamentary chambers in Delhi, all stage their authority within stone rhythms Rome standardized. A podium, a colonnaded facade, a vaulted chamber where debate echoes. Tour guides boast of neoclassical aesthetics, but you trace the lineage further, through Byzantine pendentives to Pantheon coffers, revealing a continuous conversation about proportion, light, and civic dignity. Even minimalist glass towers implicitly respond to that conversation, defining themselves against the weighty precedent as deliberately as a later Latin poet might riff on Virgil. Yet architecture is merely the visible skin of deeper continuities. When a local newspaper invokes the phrase public trust, it draws from the juristic doctrine of res publica, which framed state power as stewardship rather than possession. Legislative committees schedule fiscal years because a Roman Senate discovered budgets make politics measurable. Auditors still talk about capitals and capitations, the latter a head tax once assessed in denarii. In court, advocates cite habeas corpus and amicus curiae, unmoved by the irony that their pleas blend common law nuance with Republican Latin. If you zoom out to international institutions, the European Union debating subsidiarity, the United Nations tracing peacekeeping mandates, you find procedural DNA that remembers provincial assemblies, federated municipalities, and the Pax Romana's premise that commerce flows best when roads and rules are shared. Religion frames your journey as well. You may pass a cathedral where stained glass glows with saints canonized in Latin, a mosque whose mihrab incorporates spolia from a late antique basilica, or a synagogue chanting psalms translated by Hellenistic Jews for a polyglot oikumene. All three traditions metabolized Roman logistics and literacy while resisting imperial theology. Step into a modern church service, and you might still hear Nicene creeds shaped in councils, convened under imperial aegis. Step out, and you might bump into a secular protester quoting the same tradition's rhetoric of universal human dignity, demonstrating how Christian and post-Christian ethics both spring from late Roman questions about law and conscience. Even atheists who defend separation of church and state deploy a vocabulary invented when emperors first grappled with multi-faith governance. Commerce, too, echoes that grappling. Multinational corporations register themselves as societates, sell bona fide goods, and protect trademarks. Marks once burned onto amphorae, leaving Iberian vineyards for Ostia's keys. Maritime insurers calculate risk using general average rules pioneered by Rhodian sea traders under Roman oversight. When hackers debate whether code can be patented, they revisit dilemmas Roman jurists pondered about natural law versus enacted statute.
Bitcoin enthusiasts employ the term minting without noting that the mint as sovereign guarantee dates to Republican coins stamped with SPQR. Even your pocket change, nickels and euros sporting laurels, eagles, liberty goddesses, honors and iconography minted to convince distant shepherds that Rome's abstract authority had a familiar face. Political culture remains perhaps the most resonant arena of inheritance. Campaign strategists refine slogans that promise res novae against an entrenched senatus. Populists rail at elites, much as populares denounced optimates. Constitutions from Philadelphia to Brasilia organized checks and balances reminiscent of consuls, tribunes, and senates, despite technological contexts unimaginable to Cicero. When presidents deliver State of the Union addresses in amphitheater-styled chambers, they reenact gestures of Republican accountability, even as broadcast satellites beam the performance worldwide. An irony Cicero might savor, given his faith in rhetoric's power over distance. Protest movements evoke catacomb martyrs, plebeian secessions, or Spartacus's uprising to frame their struggles in narratives older than the printing press. You witness that rhetorical potency each time a science fiction novelist names a star cruiser Imperator, or a video game designer populates arenas with gladiatorial avatars. Hollywood epics, set in galaxies far away, still stage senatorial coups and clone trooper legions, signaling that Rome supplies the default grammar for imagining universal empire. Academic fields from geology's stratigraphic Campanian stage to medicine's ulna and radius cling to Latin not merely for precision, but because within global pluralism, a dead language offends no living polity. Even Silicon Valley startups christen products Aquila, Centurion, or Prima, reaching for the aura that supposedly attends Latin brevity. Meanwhile, post-colonial nations wrestle with Rome's darker lessons. You travel through highways in North Africa, paralleling Roman limes, passing marginalized communities who recall Conquest's costs alongside its aqueducts. Debates about cultural appropriation, citizenship, and reparations tangle with precedents set when Carthaginian farmland became latifundia and when provincials were offered rights, mainly to fund armies. The resilience of Roman models invites admiration and critique in equal measure, prompting societies to adopt, adapt, or repudiate facets of the legacy according to local wounds and ambitions. By the time you watch an international Mars rover touch down in a crater named Elysium Planitia, a Latin echo of mythic afterlife, you grasp how thoroughly Roman conceptual scaffolding undergirds humanity's reach beyond Earth. Engineers split mission phases into anomaly reports, contingency protocols, and planetary protection guidelines that parallel imperial manuals on road surveying, disaster relief,
and frontier quarantines. Should settlers one day terraform valleys under a purple Martian sky, they will likely zone land via grids, debate senatorial quotas of oxygen, and inscribe legal plaques in a lingua franca, dotted with Latin borrowings. Stepping back onto an evening sidewalk, city lights forming a neon Milky Way overhead, you reflect on how the world's complexity is still legible through Roman lenses: republic versus empire, public good versus private ambition, citizenship versus exclusion, innovation versus durability. Concrete may have replaced pozzolana with fly ash, and forums may pulse with fiber optic cables instead of gossip. But the questions coursing through legislative halls, design studios, and protest marches remain versions of dilemmas first tested on the Tiber's banks. You realize Rome's ultimate legacy is not marble or Latin, but a toolkit for thinking about scale, how to weld a community from strangers, tame space with geometry, argue ideals into statutes, and let those statutes evolve without losing the thread of common purpose. Whether humanity employs that toolkit to fortify hierarchies or to broaden belonging will decide whether the next millennium cites Rome as blueprint or cautionary tale. But either way, you will still feel its outline beneath the fresh coat of each new epoc's paint. From wolf-nursed twins to glass-walled airports, our whirlwind tour shows how Rome still maps our roads, laws, and imaginations. Empires rise, cities fall, but the Roman toolkit, citizenship, engineering, storytelling, keeps resurfacing wherever people try to organize the vast and the new. I'd love to hear from you. Which Roman echo surprised you most, and where do you still spot it in everyday life? Drop your thoughts below. Hit like if you learned something, and subscribe for more journeys through time. Thanks for traveling with me tonight. Rest easy, and may your dreams march on well-paved roads under bright Roman stars. Good night.